Section 15 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Quiller-Couch. Parson Jack's Fortune, Part 4. Parson Jack walked home with a volume of Gilbert's Survey and another of the Parochial History of Cornwall under his arm, and Parker's Glossary in his skirt pocket. He began that evening with the Parochial History article, Langona, and smoked his pipe over it until midnight in a sort of rapture it would be hard to analyze. In fact, no doubt it was made up of that childish delight which most men feel on reading in print what they know perfectly well already. The eastern end of the north aisle is used as a vestry, and the eastern end of the south aisle is impropriated to the church warden's use. Yes, that was right. And the inscription on the one marble tablet was correctly given, and the legend over the south porch, Ego sum Janua per me qui intrabit servabitur. But the delight of recognition was mixed with that of discovery. The lower part of the tower was early English, the upper perpendicular. A pause here, and a reference to Parker. The nave, too, perpendicular. Ah, then, it could only have been the upper part, the belfry, which fell in and destroyed the nave. What was the date? 1412. And they both had been rebuilt together on the call of Edmund Stafford, Bishop of Exeter, in the August of that year. He read on, the familiar at each step opening new bypaths into the unguessed. But the delight of delights was to hug, while he read, his purpose to change all this story of ruin, to give it a new and happier chapter, to stand out eminent among the forgotten vicars of Langona. The book slid from his knee to the floor with a crash. He picked it up carefully, turned down the lamp, laughed to himself, and went off to bed shivering but happy. He awoke to fresh daydreams. Daydreams filled the next week with visions of the church in all its destined beauty. To be sure, they were extravagant enough. Fantasies in which flying buttresses and flamboyant traceries waltzed around solid Norman and rigid perpendicular. Nightmares of undigested Parker, but they kept Parson Jack happy. He had not forgotten to answer Messrs. Cudmore's letter, thanking them for their information, and adding that he proposed to pay a visit to Plymouth, and would call upon Major Bromham with that gentleman's leave, and discuss the legacy. They replied that their client was just then in the north of Devon on a shooting party, but would return to Plymouth by an afternoon train on the following Wednesday, and grant Mr. Flood an interview. The tone of this letter, as of the previous one, was unmistakably cold, but Parson Jack read nothing more in it than professional formality. On the Wednesday, however, when he reached Plymouth, he presented himself at Messrs. Cudmore's office, and was admitted to see the head of the firm. The manner of his reception began to puzzle him. "Mr. Flood," began Mr. Cudmore senior with the faintest possible bow, "our client, Major Bromham, is not returning until late this afternoon by the 4:40 train. In fact, I myself dictated the letter in reply to yours, and fancied I had made it explicit." "Oh, quite. I called merely in the hope that you would give me some further information about my brother's will, since apart from this legacy I know nothing." "You must excuse me, but I prefer to leave that to the Major. In any case, the will is to be proved without delay, and may then, as you know, be inspected for a shilling." Parson Jack, guileless man that he was, had a way of putting a straight question. "I want to know," said he quietly, "why on earth you are treating me like this." "My dear sir," began the lawyer, but Parson Jack cut him short. "I, for my part, will be plain with you. I asked to see the will simply because I know nothing of my brother's property, and wish to see how his wife and children are provided for. There is nothing extraordinary in that, surely." The lawyer pondered, eyeing him. Clearly, there was something in this shabbily dressed clergyman which countered his expectations. "The person who could best satisfy you on this point would be Mrs. Flood herself. But I take it you have no desire to see her personally?" "Mrs. Flood? You mean my brother's wife?" "Certainly." But is she here in Plymouth?" Parson Jack's eyes opened wide. "I presume so. Hoe Terrace, she informs me, has been her address for these 8 years. But of course you are aware—" "Aware, sir? I am aware of nothing. Least of all am I aware of any reason why I should not call upon her. Hoe Terrace, did you say? What number?" 34. You will bear in mind that I have not advised—" "Oh, dear me, no, you have advised nothing. Good morning, Mr. Cudmore." And Parson Jack, fuming, found himself in the street. He filled and lit his pipe to soothe his humour, but he forgot that the clergy of Plymouth do not as a rule smoke clay pipes in the public streets, and the attention he excited puzzled and angered him yet further. He set it down to his threadbare coat and rustic boots. It was in no sweet mood that he strode up Hoe Terrace, eyeing the numbers above the doors, and halted at length to knock out his pipe before a house with an unpainted area railing, to which a small boy in ragged knickerbockers was engaged in attaching with a string the tail of a protesting puppy. "I shouldn't do that if I were you," said Parson Jack, rapping the bowl of his pipe against his boot heel. "I don't suppose you would," retorted the small boy. "But then there's some parsons wouldn't smoke a clay." Before Parson Jack could discover a repartee, the door opened and a young man with a weak chin and bright yellow boots came out laughing, followed by a good-looking girl who turned on the step to close the door behind her. Although in black, she was outrageously overdressed. An enormous black feather nodded above her picture hat, and with one hand she held up her skirt, revealing a white embroidered petticoat deplorably stained with mud. In the act of turning, she caught sight of the small boy, and at once began to rate him. "Haven't I told you 50 times to let that dog alone? Go indoors this instant and get yourself cleaned. For my part, I don't know what Tillotson means, letting you out of school so early." "I haven't been to school," the boy announced, catching at a dirty sheet of newspaper which fluttered against the railing, and nonchalantly folding it into a cocked hat. "Your mumps have been all right for a week. There's not the slightest risk of infection, and you know it. You don't tell me you've persuaded mother—" "I haven't said a word to her," the boy interrupted. "It isn't mumps, it's these breeches. If you can't find time to darn 'em, I'm not going to school till somebody can." The young man tittered, and the girl, with a toss of her head and a glance at Parson Jack, who was pretending to tie his bootlace, accepted defeat. "Where did you pick up that puppy?" asked Parson Jack after watching the pair up the street. "What's that to you?" "Nothing at all, only I'm a judge of wire-haired terriers, and he has a touch of breed somewhere." "Well, if you won't answer that question, I'll try you with another. Is that Gertrude or Ada?" He nodded up the street. "That's Ada. Gertrude is indoors trimming a hat. You seem to know a heap about us." "Not much, but I'm going to call and find out more if I can. You're Richard, I suppose?" "Dick, for short. Ring the bell if you like, and I'll run around and open the door. Only don't say I didn't warn you." This sounded like an absurd echo of the lawyer, and set Parson Jack smiling. "We don't subscribe to anything or take any truck in parsons, and the slavey has a whitlow on her finger, and mother's having fits over the cooking. But come in if you want to." "Thank you, I will." While Parson Jack ascended to the front door and rang at the bell, Dick skipped down the area steps and presently opened to him with a mock start of surprise. "Beg your pardon," said he, "but I took you for the rates or the broker's man." He winked as he ushered in the visitor. The running click of a sewing machine sounded above stairs, and up from the basement floated an aroma of fried onions and filled the passage. "First turning to the right," admonished the boy, and stepping past him to the head of the basement stairs, called down, "Mother! I say, Mother! Here's a gentleman to see you." "Then," came the answer, "tell Gertie to step down and find out what he wants. I'm busy." Parson Jack discreetly shut the door and fell to studying the not over clean drawing room, which was tricked out with muslin draperies, cheap Japanese fans, photographs, mostly of officers in the uniform of the Royal Marines, and such artistic trifles as painted tambourines, sabots, drain pipes, and milking stools. In one wicker chair, the wicker daubed with royal red enamel, lay a banjo. In another was curled a sleeping terrier, indubitably the mother of the puppy outside. Near the door stood a piano with a comic opera score on the music rest, open at number 12, "I'm a cheery Fusilieri, oh!" and on its rosewood top an ashtray full of cigarette ends, and a shaded lamp the base of which needed wiping. The terrier awoke, yawned, and was waddling down from its couch to make friends when Master Dick returned. "Mother wants to know who you are, and what's your business. Gertie wouldn't come down when she heard you weren't Jack Phillips." "Then tell your mother that I am your uncle, John Flood. That will satisfy her, perhaps." "You!" Dick took him in from top to toe in a long, incredulous stare, but turned and went without another word. It may have been 5 minutes before the door opened and Mrs. Flood entered, with an air nicely balanced between curiosity, hauteur, and injured innocence. A shabby, genteel woman in a widow's cap and a black cashmere gown, which had been too near the frying pan. "Good morning." Mrs. Flood bowed stiffly, not to say stonily, folded her wrists accurately in front of her over her waistband, and waited. "I am John Flood, you know, poor Lionel's brother. I have just come from Cudmore and Cudmore's, the solicitors, to talk with you, if I may, about this will. It seems that I have a legacy, but beyond this I know nothing, and indeed until Messrs. Cudmore wrote I wasn't even aware of an illness." Mrs. Flood's eyes seemed to answer, if such a thing could be said in a ladylike way, that he might tell that to the Marines. But without relenting their hostility, she took occasion to mop them. "It was a cruel will," she murmured. "My husband and I had differences. In fact, we have lived apart for many years. Still," she broke off, "you know, of course, that he went wrong, took to living with natives and adopted their horrible ways. In the end, I believe he turned Hindu." "God bless my soul, but he used to write regularly, up to the end." "No doubt." The two words were full of spiteful meaning, though what that meaning was, Parson Jack could not guess. His letters gave no hint of this. Again Mrs. Flood's bitter smile gave him, politely, the lie. "He drank, too," she went on after a cold pause. "I had always supposed it was the one thing those natives didn't do. We thought of contesting the will on the ground of undue influence and his mind being gone." "Did Lionel leave them much, then?" "Them?" she queried. "His friends over there, the natives." "He left nothing but this legacy of £5,000 and the residue in equal shares to his poor family." Here her handkerchief came into play again. "Only, as it turns out, there isn't any residue, scarcely a penny more when all is realized, except the pension, of course." Unmasking her batteries with sudden spite, she added, "Even between you, I couldn't be robbed of that." Parson Jack controlled himself. He was genuinely sorry for the woman, but either cheek showed a red spot, and his voice shook a little as he answered, "This is a trifle gratuitous, then, your talk about undue influence." "The proof of the pudding is in the eating," replied Mrs. Flood, with a small and vicious titter, not because she believed him to be guilty, or that it would do any good, but simply because her instinct told her it would hurt. That seems to close the discussion. Parson Jack bowed with honest, if clumsy, dignity. "I am sorry, madam, for what you have told me, but my regrets had better be expressed to Major Bromham." "Regrets indeed," sniffed Mrs. Flood. And these were the last words he ever heard from her. A minute later he found himself in the street, walking towards the Hoe, and drawing deep breaths as his lungs felt the sea breeze. He had not the least notion of his direction, but as he went he muttered to himself, and for a parson's his words sounded deplorably like swearing. "Hi, hi!" called a shrill voice behind him. He swung right about and found himself frowning down upon Master Dick. "How did you like it?" inquired that youngster, panting. "She's a caution, the mater, but it wasn't a patch on what I've heard her promise to give you if ever she sets eyes on you." "Indeed? How do you know, pray?" "Why, I listened at the door, of course," was the unabashed reply. "But I don't believe a word of it, you know," he added reassuringly. "A word of what?" "That rot about undue influence." "I thank you. Did you follow me to tell me this?" "Well, I dunno. Yes, I guess I did. You're a good man. I saw that at once, though you do smoke a clay pipe." "Thank you again for the reminder." Parson Jack pulled out his clay and filled it. "So I'm a good man." Dick nodded. "I'm not saying anything about the legacy. That's hard lines on us, of course, but I believe you. There's no chance of my being a gentleman now, like you, but," with a wry grin, "I'm not the sort of chap to bear malice." They had walked on through the gate leading to the Hoe, and were in full view now of the splendid panorama of the Sound. "And why shouldn't you be a gentleman?" asked Parson Jack, halting and cocking down an eye upon this queer urchin. "Well, there's a goodish bit against it, you'll allow. You saw what we're like at home." He looked up at Parson Jack frankly enough, but into his speech there crept a strange embarrassment, too old for his years. "I mean, you saw enough without my telling you, and I mustn't give the show away." "No, to be sure," assented Parson Jack. "Dick, you've the makings of a good fellow," he added musingly. But the boy's eyes had wandered to the broad sheet of water below. "Crikey, there she goes!" he cried, and jerked his arm towards an unwieldy battleship nosing her way out of the Hamows, her low bows tracing a thin line of white. For half a minute they stood watching her. "She's ugly enough, in all conscience," commented Parson Jack. "She's a holy terror, but perhaps you don't believe in turrets, nor do I to that extent. It's tempting Providence." "In what way?" "Top hamper," said Dick shortly, "but she's a terror all the same." "What's her name, I wonder?" "Sakes, you don't say you don't know the old Devastation? Why, it's 15 years or so since they launched her at Portsmouth, and I hear tell she'll have to be reconstructed, though even then I guess they won't trust her far at sea. She has no speed either, for these days, she's a holy fraud." And Master Dick poured in a broadside of expert criticism as the monster felt her way and slowly headed around the winter buoy into the Smeaton Pass. "Nevertheless, you wouldn't object to be on board of her?" "Don't." The boy's eyes had filled on a sudden. "You mayn't mean it, but it hurts." 4 hours later, in the early dusk, Parson Jack stepped into the street after shaking hands with Major Bromham at the door. What is more, the Major stood bareheaded in the doorway for some moments and stared after him. Dick had echoed Lawyer Cudmore once more that day. It was now the Major's turn to echo Dick. "That's a good man," he muttered to himself. Curiously like his brother, too, in the days before he went wrong. But Lionel Flood has a soft streak in him, and India found it out This parson seems tougher, result of hard work and plain living, no doubt. His musings at this point grew involved, and he frowned. Says he knew nothing of Lionel's affairs, offers to show me all the letters to prove it, but this behaviour of his is proof enough. Deuced handsome behaviour, too. I wonder if he can afford it. Gad, what a pack of falsehoods that woman has poured into me. She always had a gift of circumstantial lying. I believe if Lionel had kept a tight rein on her and shown her the whip now and then. But what's the use of speculating? Anyway, it's rough on the parson, and if I hadn't to consider Dick and the girls... Dusk had given way to gaslight, and Parson Jack still paced the streets, intending but still deferring to find a dinner and a night's lodging. He had shaken hands with Major Bromham in a mood of curious exaltation. He had decided almost without a struggle. To his mind the question was a clear one of right and wrong, and no argument helped it. Still, a man did not renounce £5,000 every day of his life, and when he does, has some right to pat his conscience on the back. He derived some pleasure, too, from picturing the pretty gratitude with which his beneficiaries would hear Major Bromham's message. He did not know Mrs. Flood. But his church. He had forgotten it, or almost forgotten, and the recollection came upon him like a blow. He halted beneath a gas lamp in dismay, not in resentment at the shattering of his dream, for he scarcely thought of himself, not in doubt, for he had done rightly, and his church could not be restored at the expense of right, but in sheer dismay before the blank certainty that now his church must fall. Nothing could save it. He must go home to it, live with it, watch it to the inevitable end. He put out a hand against an iron pillar, and of a sudden felt faint, almost sick. And as a matter of fact, he'd eaten nothing since his early breakfast. A few doors down the street, the bright lamp of a tavern. The sword and flag caught his eye. He tottered in and asked for a glass of brandy. It did him good, and he called for another. Some soldiers entering with a girl or two, and finding a clergyman seated with his glass in this not over reputable den, began to chaff. He answered gently and good-naturedly, but with a slight stutter, enough to hint at fun ahead, and they improved upon the hint. By 9 o'clock Parson Jack was silly drunk. At 11, when the premises were closed, the police found him speechless, and the rest of the night he spent in the borough lock-up. Part 5. It appeared in the newspapers, of course. Deplorable story. A clergyman fined for drunkenness. Well, this was more than even Sir Harry could stand. "I'm sorry for you, Flood," said he, when 3 days later Parson Jack appeared at Carwithiel to resign his living. "But you've taken the only proper course. Otherwise you'd have driven us to an inquiry, sequestration, no end of a scandal. I've had to keep my eyes shut once or twice in the past, as you probably guess." "You have shown me all the kindness you could," answered Parson Jack. "I won't disgust you with thanks, and there are no excuses." He picked up his hat and turned to go. "Well, look here, don't be in a hurry. What about your prospects? They're none too healthy, I'm afraid. Still, if a few pounds could give you a fresh start somewhere—" "I have no prospects, but for the moment I wasn't thinking of myself. I was thinking of Langona and the old church." "Oh, the church is all right. Clem, my nephew, has a fad in his head. He asked me yesterday for the living, in case you resigned. I tell him it's folly. A youngster oughtn't to play with his chances. But he insists that it will do him good to fling up Oxford and play parish priest for a year or two. He's taken a fancy to your church and wants to restore it. He can pay for his whims. The money's all in his branch of the family." "Restore it? The church restored?" Sir Harry looked up sharply, for the words came in a whisper of awe, almost of terror, and looking up he saw Parson Jack's eyes dilated, as a man who stares on a vision. But while they stared, there grew in them a slow, beatific surmise. "The Lord taketh away," said Parson Jack. "Blessed be the name of the Lord." 6 weeks later, the Reverend Clement Vial was inducted into the living of Langona, vacant by the resignation of the Reverend John Flood. His first sermon announced that the church was to be restored without delay, that plans were even now being prepared by an eminent architect, and that as soon as they arrived and were approved, tenders would be invited. Mr. Vial was in no hurry to take possession of the parsonage. Indeed, bachelor though he was and professed ascetic, he decided that to be habitable it needed a wing and a new kitchen at the back. For the present he accepted his uncle's invitation to use the hospitality and the library of Carwithiel. Parson Jack might give up possession at his own convenience. Nevertheless, he gave it up at once, packed his few belongings, and hired a bedroom at the widow Copping's. It appeared that he, too, needed time to look about him. And so he loitered about Langona until the architect's plans were received, discussed, approved, and submitted to tender. A Bristol builder secured the contract. The day after it was signed, Parson Jack walked over to Carwithiel again, and asked leave to speak with Mr. Vial. He wore his old working suit. "I have come to ask a favour, sir," said he, speaking humbly. "I hear that the contract for the church has been given to Miles and Company, of Bristol, and I would take it kindly if you recommended me to them as a workman." The new vicar was taken by surprise, and showed it. "I have picked up some knowledge of the work in these years," Parson Jack explained timidly, "and I know the weak points in the old fabric better than most men. As for steadiness," he wound up, "I only ask to be given a trial. You must discharge me the first time I give cause of complaint." "What on earth could I say to the man?" Mr. Vial demanded that evening, when he discussed the application with his uncle. "I hope you accepted," said Sir Harry sharply. "Yes, though I fear it was imprudent." "Fiddlestick! Speak a word for him to Miles. He won't find a better workman." And so Parson Jack stayed at Langona, and beheld his best dream take shape, though not at his command, and yet in part by his fashioning. Nay, even some measure of that personal pride for which he had once bargained was restored to him during the second year, on the day when the contractor, who shared the common knowledge of his past, but respected his unequalled knowledge of the old fabric and its weakness, his gentle ardour in learning, and his mild authority among the men, appointed him clerk of the works. In those days Parson Jack needed no man's pity, for all day long he redeemed a debt, and wrought into substance an ambition that yet grew purer, as few ambitions do, in taking substance. And with it he wove another dream, which in the intervals of labour would draw him out of the churchyard and hold him at gaze there, with his eyes on the wedge of blue sea beyond the coombe. From the hour of his fall no strong drink passed his lips. His was an almost desperate case, but he fought with two strong allies. It was as though the old church, rallying under his eyes for a new lease of life, put new blood into him, repaying his love. Also, he had Dick's letters. "Upon my word," said Sir Harry to his nephew, "I've a mind to put Flood into the living again when this business is over and you tire of your whim. I suppose there's nothing to prevent it?" There was nothing to prevent it, but as a reward it lay outside Parson Jack's speculation, perhaps beyond his desire. His reward came to him on the afternoon when, having mounted a ladder beside the new east window, he looked over his shoulder and saw Parson Kendall entering the churchyard by the lych gate, and ushering in a youngster, a mere boy still, but splendid in the uniform of a freshly blown naval cadet. Parson Jack can scarcely be said to have risen to the occasion. "Hullo, Dick," he said, descending the ladder and holding out his hand. But the rector, standing aside, made a better speech, though this too was short enough. "God fulfills himself in many ways," said the rector to himself. End of section 15.
Section 16 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendrie. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Quiller-Couch. Section 16. The Burglary Club. "Yes," said the judge, "I ought by this time to know something of Cornish juries. They acquit oftener than other juries, to be sure, and the general notion is that they incline more towards mercy. Privately, I believe that mercy has very little to do with it." "Stupidity," said the High Sheriff sententiously, and sipped his wine. His own obtuseness on the bench was notorious, and had kept adding for 30 years to the Duchy's stock of harmless merriment. "Nothing of the sort," snapped his lordship. "You can convict a man, I presume, as stupidly as you can acquit him. No, with other juries a crime is a crime, and a misdemeanour is a misdemeanour. You tell them so and they accept it. But with Cornishmen you have first to explain that the alleged offence is illegal. Next you must satisfy them that it ought to be illegal, and then, if you choose, you can proceed to prove that the prisoner committed it. They will finally discharge him on the ground that he never had the advantage of such a clear exposition of the law as they have just enjoyed." "Well, but isn't that stupidity?" persisted the High Sheriff. The judge turned impatiently and addressed a grey-headed man on his left. "Did I ever tell you, Mr. how I once enjoyed the hospitality of a Cornish village through the simple accident of being mistaken for a burglar?" The grey-headed man, an eminent Q.C. and leader of the Western Circuit, dropped an olive into his glass of sherry. He had been dozing. 2 or 3 guests and members of the junior bar drew their chairs closer. "It was in 1845," the judge began, "just after I had taken my degree, and I had been walking through Cornwall with a knapsack. No small adventure, I can tell you, in those days. The inhabitants declined to believe that any one could walk and carry a pack for the fun of the thing, and I left a trail of suspicion behind me. The folks were invariably hospitable, though convinced that I was pursuing no good. You remember, Mr. that when Telemachus visited Gerenia, he was generously entertained, and afterwards politely asked if he happened to be a pirate. My case was pretty similar, only my Cornish hosts did not ask, but took it for granted. In the first week of August, to be precise on the 4th, I reached Polreen Cove, and found lodging at the small inn. The spot and the people so pleased me that I engaged my rooms for a week. At the week's end I had decided to stay for a month. I stayed for almost 2 months. Well, as luck would have it, I had not been in Polreen 3 nights before there happened the first burglary within the memory of its oldest inhabitant. If burglary it was, I incline to think that Mrs. Giddy, the general dealer, had left her shop door unbolted, and that the culprit, after removing the bell (the door had 2 flaps, and the bell hung on a half coil of metal, was fitted to a socket inside the lower flap), had quietly walked in and made his choice. This choice was a peculiar one. 6 bars of yellow soap, a colander, some tallow candles, a pair of alpaca boots, a pair of braces, several boxes of matches, an uncertain amount of cheese, a dozen pocket handkerchiefs, a coloured almanac, 3 of Mrs. Giddy's brass weights, and the bell. He was detected 2 months later at Bristol in the act of using one of the handkerchiefs, which illustrated the descent of Moses from Mount Sinai. and 4 other handkerchiefs were found in his possession, together with Mrs. Giddy's brass weights. He had disposed of the rest of the booty, and proved to be a stowaway who had been turned out of a Cardiff schooner on Penzance Quay, penniless and starving. Nothing further was proved against him, and it still puzzles me how he made his way through the length of Cornwall, Devon, and Somerset on the not very nutritious spoils of Mrs. Giddy's shop. For the moment he got clear away. Not a soul in Polreen had set eyes on him, and as he entered the village by night, so he departed. I know now that the excitement in the cove was intense, that for weeks afterwards the women carried their silver teaspoons and chinaware to bed with them, and I should explain that the housewives of Polreen are inordinately proud of their teaspoons and chinaware, heirlooms which mark the only degrees of social importance recognised among the inhabitants of that happy cove. A family there counts its teaspoons as our old nobility counted its quarterings. A girl is judged to have made a good, bad, or indifferent match by the number of teaspoons she marries into, and the extreme act of disinheritance is symbolised not by the testamentary shilling, nor by erasing a name from the family Bible, but by alienating the family plate basket. In short, teaspoons are to the Covers what the salt cellar was to the ancient Latin races. But at the time, though I could not help observing symptoms of suppressed excitement, the Cove behaved with an outward calm, which struck me as highly creditable. To be sure, the men seemed to spend an extravagant amount of their time in the tap room of the inn, which happened to be immediately beneath my sitting room. Hour after hour the sound of their muffled conversation ascended to me through the planching, as I sat and studied Dumas, I think. Low, monotonous, untiring, it lasted from breakfast time until 9 o'clock at night, when it ceased abruptly, the company dispersed, and each man went home to reassure and protect his wife. I suppose some liquor was required to start this conversation and keep it going, just as seamen use a bucketful of water to start a ship's pump. But I must admit that during my whole stay at Polreen I never saw an inhabitant who could be described as the worse for drink. I did not know that this assemblage in the tap room was unusual and clean contrary to the men's habits, and therefore may be excused for not guessing its significance. Nor was I familiar enough with Polreen to note an even more frequent change in the atmosphere and routine of its daily life. When the weather is fine down there, the men put out to sea and the women go about their work with smiles. When it blows, the women go about their work, but resignedly and in a temper, which the men avoid by ranging up shoulder to shoulder along the wall by the lifeboat house, and gazing with approval at the weather. With approval because it relieves them of the fatigue of argument. But should the day break doubtfully, and the men incline to give themselves the benefit of the doubt, then indeed you will learn who are masters of the cove. For in extreme cases the women will even invade the rendezvous, and shrill is the noise of battle, until the weather declares unmistakably for one side or the other. Does it refuse to declare itself? Then I can promise you that half an hour will see the men routed and straggling down the beach to their boats, arching their backs and ducking their heads, maybe, under the parting volley. But, as I say, I did not know Polreen and its ways. It awoke no wonder in me to see the bulk of its male population ranged like statues, day after day, and from dawn till eve, against the wall by the lifeboat house, talking little, or ceasing at any rate to talk when I approached, smoking much, conning a serene sky, and the dimples spread on the sea by a gentle nor'westerly breeze. At intervals one or two would leisurely fall out of the line and saunter towards the inn, leaving their places to others as leisurely sauntering from the inn. It did indeed occur to me to wonder how they earned their living, for during the first fortnight, beyond the occasional hauling of a crab pot, I saw no evidence at all of labour. It was on the tip of my tongue once or twice to question them, but though polite, they clearly had no wish to be communicative. I found great difficulty in hiring a boat and the services of its owner. I wished to be rowed along the coast, to try for pollock, to inspect some of Polreen's famous caves. The men were polite again, but one boat leaked badly, another had been pulled up for the carpenter to insert a new strake, a third was too heavy, the owner of a fourth could not leave his business, it wouldn't pay him. At length I patched up a bargain with an old fisherman named Oodie, or rather Old Tom Oodie, to distinguish him from his son, who was Young Tom. He owned the most ramshackle old boat in the cove. If the others were out of repair, his was manifestly beyond it. I took my life in my hands and struck the bargain. "When do you want her?" "Now, at once," said I, "or as soon as you have had your dinner." He went back to the company by the lifeboat house. He reminded me of some ancient king consulting a company of stone gods. They looked at him, and he looked at them. I suppose a word or two was said. Half a dozen of them spat reflectively. Nobody moved. Old Tom Udy came down the beach again. We embarked and pushed off, and the row of expressionless faces watched us from the shore. In silence we visited the famous caverns. As we emerged from the last of these, I essayed some casual talk. To tell the truth, I was beginning to feel the want of it, and of course I began on the first topic of local interest, the burglary. "The odd thing to me," said I, "is that you seem to have no particular suspicions." "I'd rather you didn't talk of it," said old Tom Udy. "I got my living to get, and 'tis a day's journey to Bodmin. Though you mustn't think," he added, "that we bear any grudge." "It seems to me that you men in the cove treat the whole affair very lightly." "Iss, that's of it," he assented. "Mind you, 'tisn't right. Seemin' to me 'tis a terrible thought. Here you be, for the sake of argument, a Christian man, and in beauty next door to the angels, and the only use you make of it is to steal groceries. You don't think I'm putting it too strong?" "Not a bit." "Well, I'm glad of that, because, since you ask me, as a professin' Christian, I couldn't say any less. But you mustn't think we bear any grudge." "I'm sure I wonder you don't. And the police still have no clue?" "The police? You mean Sammy Craigo, the constable? Why, I've knawed en from a boy. Pretty thing if any person in Polreen listened to he. No, as hasn't failed so low yet as to mind anything the constable says." "Then the whole affair is as much a mystery as ever?" "Now, look'ee here, I don't want to tell nothing more about it. A still tongue makes a wise head, and there's a pollock on the end of your line." The wind struck in the north west, and day after day the regal summer weather continued. I grew tired of hauling in pollock, and determined to have a try for the more exciting conger. The fun of this, as you know, does not begin till nightfall, and it was 7 o'clock in the evening or thereabouts when we pushed off from the beach. By 8 we had reached the best grounds, and begun operations. An hour passed, or a little more, and then old Tom Udy asked when I thought of returning. "Why, bless the man," said I, "we've not had a bite yet." He glanced at me furtively while he lit a pipe. "I reckoned maybe you might have business ashore, so to speak." "What earthly business should I have in Polreen at this hour?" "Oh, well, you know best. No affair of mine. 'Tis a dark night, too." "All the better for conger, eh?" "So 'tis." He seemed about to say more, but at that moment I felt a long pull on the line, and for an hour or two the conger kept us busy. It must have been a week later, at least, for the moon was drawing to the full, that I pulled up the blind of my sitting room a little before midnight, and ravished by the beauty of the scene, for I tell you Polreen can be beautiful by moonlight, determined to stroll down to the beach, and smoke my last pipe there before going to bed. The door of the inn was locked, no doubt, but, the house standing on the steep slope of the main street, I could step easily on to the edge of the water barrel beneath my window, and lower myself to the ground. I did so. Just as I touched solid earth, I heard footsteps. They paused suddenly, and, glancing up the moonlit road, I descried the gigantic figure of Wesley Truscott, the coxswain of the lifeboat. He must have seen me, for the light on the whitewashed front of the inn was almost as brilliant as day. But whatever his business, he had no wish to meet me, for he dodged aside into the shadow of a porch, and after a few seconds I heard him tiptoeing up the hill again. I began to have my doubts about Polreen's primitive virtues. Certainly the village, as it lay bathed in moonlight, its whitewashed terraces and glimmering roofs embowered in dark clusters of fuchsia and tamarisk, seemed to harbour nothing but peace and sleeping innocence. An ebbing tide lapped the pebbles on the beach, each pebble distinct and glistening as the water left it. Far in the quiet offing the lights of a fishing fleet twinkled like a line of jewels through the haze. Half-way down the beach I turned for a backward look at the village. Now the wall by the lifeboat house looks on the cove. Its front is turned from the village and the village street, and can only be seen from the beach. You may imagine my surprise, then, as I turned and found myself face to face with a dozen tall men, standing there upright and silent. "Good heavens!" I cried. "What is the matter? What brings you all here at this time of night?" If I was surprised, they were obviously embarrassed. They drew together a little, as if to avoid observation, but the moon shone full on the wall, affording them not a scrap of shadow. For a moment no one answered. Then I heard mutterings, and, as I stepped up, one of the elder men, Archelaus Warne by name, was pushed forward. "We wasn't expecting of you down here," he stammered, after clearing his throat. "No reason why you should," said I. "We done our best to keep out of your way, never thinking you'd be after the boats." He nodded towards the boats drawn up on the beach at our feet. "I'm afraid I don't understand you in the least." "Well, you see, 'tis a kind of club." "Indeed?" said I, not in the least enlightened. "Iss." He turned to his companions. "I suppose I'd better tell 'em." They nodded gravely, and he resumed. "You see, 'tis this way. Ever since that burglary there's no resting for the women. My poor back is blue all over with the clome my missus takes to bed, and half a dozen times a night 'tis 'Archelaus, I'm sartin I hear some person moving. Archelaus, fit and take a light and have a look downstairs, that's a dear.' And these fellows'll tell 'ee 'tis ever bit so bad with they. 'Tis right enough in the daytime, so long as the women got us ithin hail, but by night there's no peace nor rest." One or two husbands corroborated. "Well now, I think 'twas the third night after this affair happened. I crept downstairs for the fifth time or so just to ease the old woman's mind, and opens the door, when what do I see but Billy Polkinghorne here, sitting on his own doorstep like a lost dog. 'Oh,' says I, 'so thee'rt feeling o't too?' 'Feeling o't,' says he, 'derned if this isn't the only place I can get a wink of sleep.' 'Come stway along to Wall End and tetch a pipe,' says I. That's how it began. And now, ever since Billy thought 'pon the plan of setting someone, turn and turn, to watch your window, there's nothing to hurry us. Why, only just as you came along, Billy was saying, 'Burglary,' he says. Why, I hadn't been so happy in mind since the Indian Queen came ashore. 'Watch my window? Why, the—' And then, as light broke on me, 'Look here,' I said, 'you don't mean to tell me you've been suspecting me of the burglary all this time?' 'You mustn't think,' said Archelaus Warne, 'that we bear any grudge.' Well," the judge concluded, "as I told you, the thief was apprehended a week or two later, and my innocence established. But oddly enough, some 30 years after I had to try a case at the assizes here, in which Archelaus Warne, very old and infirm, appeared as a witness, I recognised him at once, and when I sent for him afterwards and inquired after my friends at Polreen, his first words were, 'There now, I wasn't so far wrong after all. I knowed you must be mixed up with these things, one way or another.'" End of section 16, The Burglary Club.
Section 17 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. Concerning St. John of Jerusalem. Let those who know my affection for Troy consider what my feelings were the other day, when on my return from a brief jaunt to London, I alighted at the railway station amid all the tokens of a severe and general catastrophe. The porter who opened the door for me had a bandaged head. George, the bus driver, carried his right arm in a sling, but professed himself able to guide his vehicle through our tortuous streets left-handed. I had declined the offer, and was putting some sympathetic question, when a procession came by, 4 children of serious demeanour conveyed a groaning comrade on a stretcher, while a couple more limped after in approved splints. I stopped them, of course. The rearmost sufferer, who wore on his shin bone a wicker trellis of the sort used for covering flower plots, and a tourniquet contrived with a pebble and a handkerchief about his femoral artery, informed me that it was a case of first aid to the injured, which he was rendering at some risk to his own compound fracture. "It's wonderful," said George with a grin, "what crazes the youngsters will pick up." Thereupon the truth came out. It appeared that during my absence a member of the Ambulance Association of St. John of Jerusalem had descended upon the town with a course of lectures, and the town had taken up the novelty with its usual spirit. I said a course of lectures, but in Troy we are nothing if not thorough-going, and by this time, so George informed me, 3 courses were in full swing. The railway servants and jettymen, our instructor's earliest pupils, had arrived at restoring animation to the apparently drowned, while a mixed class, drawn from the townsfolk generally, were learning to bandage, and the members of our Young Women's Christian Association had attended but 2 lectures and still dallied with the wonders of the human frame. George told me all about it on our way through the town, for I had consented to be driven on condition that he removed his arm from the sling, and he could not deny this to an old friend, as I make free to call myself. Besides, he was bursting to talk. To be sure, he slipped it back for a few moments as we breasted the hill beyond the post office, and his horses dropped to a walk. I fancy that he glanced at me apologetically, but since there was comparatively little danger hereabouts, I thought it more delicate to look the other way. "And the Chamber of Commerce has not protested?" I asked. "We call it the Chamber of Commerce for euphony's sake. It is, in fact, an association which keeps an eye upon the Parish Council, Harbour Board, and Great Western Railway, and incites these bodies to make our town more attractive to visitors. It consists mainly of lodging-house keepers, and has this summer prevailed on the railway company to issue cheap Saturday market tickets to Plymouth, a boon which the visitor will soon learn, if we may take our own experience as a test, to rank high among the minor comforts of life." No, the Chamber of Commerce had not protested, and yet it occurred to me more than once during the next few days that strangers attracted to Troy by its reputation as a health resort must have marvelled as they walked our streets, where cases of sunstroke, frostbite, snakebite, and incipient croup challenged their pity at every corner. The very babies took their first steps in splints, and when they tumbled were examined by their older playmates, and pronounced to be suffering from apoplexy or alcoholic poisoning, as fancy happened to suggest. I believe that a single instruction in the association's handbook, carefully italicized there, I must admit, alone saved our rising generation. It ran, "Unless perfectly sure that the patient is intoxicated, do not give the emetic." To be sure, we left these extravagances to the children, But childhood, after all, is a relative term, and in Troy we pass through it to sober age by nice gradations, which take time. Already a foreign sailor, who had committed the double imprudence of drinking heavily at the Crown and Anchor, and falling asleep afterwards on the foreshore while waiting for his boat, was complaining vigorously, through his vice-consul, of the varieties of treatment practised upon his insensible body, and only the difficulty of tracing 5 smart bandages in a town where 500 had been sold in a fortnight averted a prosecution. I was even prepared for a visit from Sir Felix Williams, our worthy squire, who seldom misses an opportunity of turning our local enthusiasms to account, and sometimes does me the honour to enlist my help, but scarcely for the turn his suggestions took. "You are, of course, interested in this movement," he began. "I have to be, seeing that I live in the midst of it. You have joined the ambulance class, I hear. Do you think I would neglect a precaution so obvious? Until their enthusiasm abates, I certainly shall range myself among the first aiders rather than the injured." "My idea was to strike while the iron is hot." "Oh," said I, "a town with so many in the fire." "And I thought perhaps we could manage to connect it in some way with the Primrose League." "But what can it have to do with the Primrose League?" I asked stiffly. I will admit now to a slight prejudice against the ambulance business, due perhaps to the lecturer's having chosen to start it in my absence. Sir Felix was disappointed and showed it. "Why, it was you," he reminded me, "who helped us last year by setting the widows to race for a leg of mutton." I was a symbolist in those days, and, excuse me, Sir Felix, it was not last year, but the year before. Last year we had the surrender of Cronje at Paardeberg, with the widows dressed up as Boer women. "Is that so? I thought we had Cronje 2 years ago, but no doubt you are right. Now I thought that with our Primrose fete coming on, and everybody just now taking such an interest in the Empire—" "To be sure!" I cried. "First aid to the Empire. It will look well on the bills." Sir Felix rubbed his hands together, a trick of his when he is pleased. "It's an idea, eh? A brilliant one." "Well, but you haven't heard all." He looked at me almost slyly. "It occurred to me that while associating this enthusiasm of ours with the imperial idea, we might at the same time do a good turn for ourselves. You think that permissible?" "Permissible? For what else does an empire exist?" "Quite so. As I was saying to Lady Williams only this morning, we must bring home to less thoughtful persons a sense of its beneficence. Now, it occurs to me, why go on subscribing to these great public nursing funds in which our mite is a mere drop in the ocean, when, by sending up a nurse from our own town, she would, of course, be a member of the League, not only should we have the satisfaction of knowing that our help is effective, but the young woman would be earning a salary and supporting herself." "Admirable," said I. "It would look so much better in the papers, too." "You see, we have at this moment a score of young women, all natives of the town and members of the League, undergoing instruction from our lecturer. After the course there will be an examination, and then, with the lecturer's help, and the advice, if I might suggest it, of Lady Williams, who can tell him if the candidate's family be respectable and deserving, we can surely select a young person to do us credit." Sir Felix took his departure in the cheerfullest temper, and I record his suggestion as one eminently worthy of his head and his heart, although subsequent events have, alas, brought it to naught. I doubt if we shall send up a nurse from Troy. Indeed, I doubt if there will even be an examination. Last evening the Young Women's Christian Association attended its 6th ambulance lecture. The subject, roller bandaging, being a practical one, a small boy was had in, set on the platform, and bandaged in sight of the audience, plain bandaged, reverse bandaged, figure of 8 bandaged, bandaged on forefinger, thumb, hand, wrist and forearm, elbow, shoulder, knee, ankle, foot. He declares that he enjoyed himself thoroughly. After each demonstration the young women took a turn, and practised with such assiduity that an hour slipped pleasantly away. The bandages were applied, the spirals neatly stitched, and the stitches promptly snipped for the next pupil to begin. An occasional prick with the needle evoked no more than a playful remonstrance from the boy, and a ripple of laughter from the fair executants. At length, alas, Miss Sophie Rabling, in snipping her bandage from the boy's foot, fumbled, and drove a point of the scissors sharply into his toe. With a howl he caught at his foot, from which 1 or 2 drops of blood were trickling, and the sight of it so affected Miss Sophie that she dropped upon the platform in a swoon. A classmate in the body of the hall almost instantly followed her example. The lecturer, I am bound to say, behaved admirably. So far was he from losing his head that he instantly seized on the accident to turn it to account. "First aid!" he cried. "Subject fainting. Patient number 1. Head to be pressed down below her knees and kept there for a few minutes. Patient number 2 to be extended on the floor, care being taken to keep head and body level. A form being handy, we could, as an alternative, have hung patient number 1 over it, head downwards." But at this point, unfortunately, the humour of the situation became too much for Miss Gertrude Handsomebody, another of the students. She began to titter, went on to laugh uncontrollably, then to clench her hands and sob. "Subject, hysterics!" called the lecturer. "Treatment. Be firm with the patient, hold her firmly by the wrists, and threaten her with cold water." He spoke to empty benches. The rest of his pupils had escaped from the room, and were now on their way home, and running for dear life. I do not expect that St. John of Jerusalem will figure prominently in our primrose fate. My reason for saying so is an urgent letter just received from Sir Felix, who wishes to confer with me in the course of the day. End of section 17. Section 18 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. Cox versus Prettyman. We are not litigious in Troy, and we obey the laws of England cheerfully if we sometimes claim to interpret them in our own way. I leave others to determine whether the chief constable's decision that 1 policeman amply suffices for us be an effect or a cause, but certain it is that we rarely trouble any court, and almost never that of a size. This accounts in part for the popular interest awakened by the suit of Cox versus Prettyman, heard a few days ago at the Bodmin Assizes. I say in part because the case presented, as the newspapers phrase it, some unusual features, and differed noticeably from the ordinary action for breach of promise. No harm in that, you will say. Indeed, no, and we should have regarded it as no more than our due, but for an apprehension that the conduct alleged against the defendant concerned us all by compromising the good name of our town. At any rate, last Wednesday found the streets full of citizens hurrying to the railway station, and throughout the morning our station master had difficulty in handling the traffic. The journey to Bodmin is not a long one, as the crow flies, but, as our carpenter, Mr. Handsomebody, put it, we are not crows, and that being the case, naturally resent being packed 16 in a compartment. Mr. Handsomebody taxed the Great Western Company with lack of foresight in not running excursion trains, and appealed to me to support his complaint. I argued, with the general approval of our fellow travellers, that there was something heartless in the idea of an excursion to listen to the recital of a woman's wrongs, especially of Miss Cox's, whom we had known so long and esteemed. Driven from this position, Mr. Handsomebody took a fresh stand on the superiority of the old broad-gauge carriages, and this, since it raised no personal question, we discussed in very good humour while we unpacked and ate our luncheons. In the midst of our meal, a lady at the far end of the compartment heaved a sigh and ejaculated, "Poor thing," which at once set us off discussing the case anew. We agreed that such conduct as Prettyman's was fortunately rare amongst us. We tried to disclaim him. No easy matter, since his father and mother had been natives of Troy, and he had spent all his life in our midst. The lady in the corner challenged Mr. Handsomebody to deny that our town was deteriorating, the rising generation more mischievous than its parents, and given to mitching from school and cigarette smoking, if not to worse. Now, this was a really damaging attack, for Mr. Handsomebody not only presides over our school board, but has a son in the tobacco business. He met it magnificently. He would dismiss, he said, the cigarette question as one upon which, heaven knew with how little justice, he might be suspected of private bias. But on the question of truancy he had something to say, and he would say it. To begin with, he would admit that the children in Troy played truant. The percentage of school attendance was abnormally low. Yes, he admitted the fact, and thanked the lady for having called attention to it, since it bore upon the subject now uppermost in our minds. He had here, and he drew from his pocket a magazine article, some statistics to which he would invite our attention. They showed the average school attendance in Cornwall to be lower than in any county of England or Wales. But, and Mr. Handsomebody raised his forefinger, the same statistician in the very same paper proves the average of criminal prosecutions in Cornwall to be the lowest in England and Wales. "And you infer," I began, as he paused triumphantly. "I infer nothing, sir. I leave the inference to be drawn by our faddists in education, and I only hope they'll enjoy it." Well, apart from its bearing on Mr. Handsomebody's position as chairman of our board, which we forbore to examine, this discovery consoled us somewhat, and amused us a great deal, until we reached Bodmin, when we hurried at once to the assize court. I have said that the action, Cox versus Prettyman, was for damages for breach of promise of marriage. Both parties are natives and parishioners of Fowey, and attend the same place of worship. The plaintiff, Miss Rebecca Cox, earns her living as a dressmaker's assistant. The defendant is our watchmaker, and opened a shop of his own but a few months before approaching Miss Cox with proposals of marriage. This was 15 years ago. I may mention that some kind of counterclaim was put in for goods delivered, the goods in question being a musical box and sundry small articles for parlour amusement, such as a solitaire tray, 2 packs of patience cards, a race game, and the like. But the defendant did not allege that these had been sent or accepted as whole or partial quittance of his contract to marry, and I can only suppose that he pleaded them in mitigation of damages. Miss Cox asked for £150. Her evidence was in quiet but resolute tones, and for some time disclosed nothing sensational. The circumstances in which Mr. Prettyman had sued for and obtained the promise of her hand differed in no important particular from those which ordinarily attend the fiançailles of respectable young persons in Troy, and for 12 years his courtship ran an even course. After this, asserted Miss Cox, his attentions cooled. He was friendly and kind enough when we met, and still talked of enlarging his shop front and marrying in the near future, but his visits were not frequent enough to be called courting. Of late, though living in the same street, she had only seen him on Sundays, and even so he would be occupied almost all the day and evening with services, Sunday school, prayer meetings, and occasional addresses. At length she taxed him with indifference, and, finding his excuses unsatisfactory, was persuaded by her friends to bring the present action. She liked the man well enough, but for the last 2 or 3 years his heart hadn't been in it. He didn't do any proper courting. Defendant's counsel, a young man, attempted in cross-examination to lead Miss Cox to reveal herself as an exacting young woman. "Do you assert that at length you came to see nothing of defendant during the week?" "Only through the shop window as I went by to my work, and of late when he saw me coming he would screw a magnifying glass in his eye and pretend to be busy with his watchmaking. I believe he did it to avoid looking at me, and also because I couldn't bear him with his face screwed up. It makes such a difference to his appearance." "Gently, gently, Miss Cox. You must not give us your mere suppositions. Now, did he never pay you a visit, or take you for a walk, say on Wednesdays? That would be early closing day, I believe." "Never for the last 3 years, sir, after he became a Freemason. Wednesdays was lodge night." "Well, then, on Saturday, after shop hours?" "Yes, he used to come on Saturdays, till he was made a forester. The foresters meet every Saturday evening." "Mondays, then, or Tuesdays? We haven't exhausted the week yet, Miss Cox." "No, sir. Mondays he was a Rechabite and went to tent. Tuesdays he would be an ancient Druid." "Gently. On Mondays you say he was a Rechabite and went to tent. What is a Rechabite, and what does he do in a tent?" Plaintiff, dissolving in tears. "Oh, sir, if I only knew!" Here the judge interposed. A Rechabite, he believed, went to a tent, or habitation, for the purpose, among others, of abstaining from alcoholic drinks. Plaintiff, briskly. "But, my lord, you wouldn't call that proper courting." Defendant's counsel had taken this opportunity to resume his seat, but counsel for the plaintiff now arose, with a smile, to re-examine. "Did Mr. Prettyman walk out with you on Thursday evenings?" "Oh, no, sir. On Thursday evenings Mr. Prettyman was an odd fellow." "I think we have only to account for Fridays," said his lordship, after consulting his notes. "On Fridays, my lord, Mr. Prettyman was an ancient buffalo." "An ancient buffalo?" "Yes, my lord," sobbing. "I don't know what it means, but that was the last straw." "The first question for the jury to determine," said his lordship a little later, "is whether an affianced young woman, as such, has a right to expect from her betrothed such attentions as may reasonably be taken as earnest of his desire to fulfil his contract within a reasonable time. In the present instance, the fact that the contract was made does not stand in doubt. It is not disputed. Now arises a second question. Can a man who is on weekdays a Freemason, a Rechabite, an Oddfellow, a Forester, an ancient Druid, and an ancient Buffalo, and on Sundays, as I gather, a Yarmouth Bloater—" "Plymouth Brother, my lord," plaintiff's counsel corrected. "I beg your pardon, a Plymouth Brother. I say, can a man who after his betrothal voluntarily preoccupies himself with these multifarious functions be held, I will not say to have disqualified himself for that willing exchange of confidence which is the surest guarantee of lasting happiness between man and wife, but to have raised such obstacles to the fulfillment of the original contract as reasonably warrant the accusation of mala fidus?" Well, the jury held that he could, for without troubling to leave the box they gave their verdict for the plaintiff and assessed the damages at £100. Towards the close of the case we all felt ashamed of Prettyman. His defence had been weak. It struck us as almost derisory, and Mr. Handsomebody agreed with me in a whisper that under similar circumstances he or I could have made a better fight for it. The fellow had shown no sport. We blushed for our town. But Troy has a knack of winning its races on the post. Judgment, as the phrase goes, was on the point of being entered accordingly, when the defendant looked up towards the bench with a sudden happy smile. "Here, wait a minute," he said. "I have a question to put to his lordship." "Eh?" said the judge. "Certainly. What is it?" "I want to know, my lord, if I can claim the benefit of the First Offenders Act." The train on the return journey was worse crowded than ever. But nobody minded, for we had managed to give plaintiff and defendant a compartment to themselves. End of section 18. Section 19 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. The Bridals of YSSELMONDE. When the Grand Duke Ferdinand of Carinthia travelled in state to wed the Princess Sophia of YSSELMONDE, he did so by land, and for two reasons, the first being that this was the shortest way, and the second that he possessed no ships. These, at any rate, were the reasons alleged by his chancellor, to whom he left all arrangements. For himself, he took very little interest in the marriage, beyond inquiring the age of his bride. 6 years was the answer, and this seemed to him very young, for he had already passed his 10th birthday. The Pope, however, had contrived and blessed the match, so Ferdinand raised no serious objection, but in due course came to YSSELMONDE with his bodyguard of the famous green Corinthian archers, and 200 halberdiers and 12 wagons, 4 to carry his wardrobe, and the remaining 8 piled with wedding presents. On the way, while Ferdinand looked for birds' nests, the Chancellor sang the praises of the Princess Sophia, who, he declared, was more beautiful than the day. "But you have never seen her," objected Ferdinand. "No, your Highness, and that is why I contented myself with a purely conventional phrase." And the Chancellor, who practised finesse in his odd moments, began to talk of the sea, the sight of which awaited them at YSSELMONDE. "And what is the sea like?" "Well, your Highness, the sea is somewhat difficult to describe, for in fact there is nothing to compare with it." "You have seen it, I suppose?" "Sire, I have done more. For once, while serving as ambassador at Venice, I had the honour to be upset in it." With such converse they beguiled the road until they reached YSSELMONDE, and found the sea completely hidden by flags and triumphal arches. And there, after 3 days' feasting, the little Grand Duke and the still smaller Princess were married in the cathedral by the Cardinal Archbishop, and the Pope's legate handed them his master's blessing in a morocco-covered case, and as they drove back to the palace the Dutchmen waved their hats and shouted "Boomp!" but the Corinthian archers cried "Talassio!" which not only sounded better, but proved, when they obligingly explained what it meant, that the ancestors of the Grand Duke of Carinthia had lived in Rome long before any pope. On reaching the palace, the bride and bridegroom were taken to a gilded drawing-room, and there left to talk together, while the guests filled up the time before the banquet by admiring the presents and calculating their cost. Ferdinand said, "Well, that's over," and the Princess said, "Yes," for this was their first opportunity of conversing alone. "You're a great deal better than I expected," said Ferdinand reassuringly. Indeed, in her straight dress, sewn with seed pearls, and her coif of Dutch lace surmounted with a little crown of diamonds, the Princess looked quite beautiful, and he in his white satin suit, crossed with the blue ribbon of St. John Nepomuc, was the handsomest boy she had ever seen. "Besides," he added, "my Chancellor says you are hereditary High Admiral of the Ocean. It's in the marriage settlement, and that would make up for a lot. Where is it?" "The ocean?" She felt very shy still. "I've never seen it, but I believe it's somewhere at the bottom of the garden." "Suppose we go and have a look at it." She was about to say that she must ask leave of her governess, but he looked so masterful and independent that she hadn't the courage. It gave her quite a thrill as he took her hand and led her out through the low window to the great stone terrace. They passed down the terrace steps into a garden ablaze with tulip beds in geometrical patterns. At the foot ran a yew hedge, and beyond it, in a sidewalk, they came upon a scullion boy chasing a sulphur-yellow butterfly. The Grand Duke forgot his fine manners and dropped his bride's hand to join in the chase. But the boy no sooner caught sight of him than he fled with a cry of dismay and popped into an arbour. There, a minute later, the bride and bridegroom found him stooping over a churn and stirring with might and main. "What are you stirring, boy?" asked Ferdinand. "Praised be the Virgin!" said the boy. "I believe it's an ice pudding for the banquet. But they shouldn't have put the ice puddings in the same arbour as the fireworks, for, if your Highness will allow me to say so, you can't expect old heads on young shoulders." "Are the fireworks in our honour too?" "Why, of course," the scullion answered. "Everything is in your honour today." This simplified matters wonderfully. The children passed on through a gate in the garden wall and came upon a clearing beside a wood stack, and there stood a caravan with its shafts in the air. A woman sat on the tilt at the back reading, and every now and then glancing towards two men, engaged in deadly combat in the middle of the clearing, who shouted as they thrust at one another with long swords. The little princess, who, except when driven in her state coach to the cathedral, had never before strayed outside the garden, turned very pale and caught at her husband's hand. But he stepped forward boldly. "Now yield thee, caitiff, or thine hour has come," shouted one of the fighters, and flourished his blade. "Sooner I'll die than tum-de-tum-de-tum," the other answered quite as fiercely. "Slave of thine become," said the woman from the caravan. "Thank you. Sooner I'll die than slave of thine become." He laid about him with a fresh vigour. "Put down your swords," commanded Ferdinand. "And now tell me who you are." "We are Valentine and Orson," they answered. "Indeed?" Ferdinand had heard of them, and shook hands affably. "Then I'm very glad to make your acquaintance." "And," said they, "we are rehearsing for the performance at the palace tonight in your Highness's honour." "Oh, so this is in our honour too?" "To be sure," said the woman, "and I am to dress up as Hymen and speak the epilogue in a saffron robe. It has some good lines. For instance, "'Ye loves and genial hours conspire to gratify this royal pair, with sons impetuous as their sire, and daughters as their mother fair.'" "Thank you," said Ferdinand, "but we're very busy today and must take one thing at a time. Can you tell us the way to the sea, please?" The woman pointed along a path which led to a moss-covered gate and an orchard where the apple blossom piled itself in pink clouds against the blue sky. As they followed the path they heard her laughing, and looked back to see her still staring after them and laughing merrily, while Valentine and Orson leaned on their swords and laughed too. The orchard was the prettiest in the whole world. Blackbirds played hide and seek beneath the boughs. Blue and white violets hid in the tall grass around the boles, and the spaces between were carpeted with daisies to the edge of a streamlet. Over the streamlet sang thrushes and goldfinches and bullfinches innumerable, and their voices shook down the blossom like a fall of pink snow which threatened to cover even the daisies. The Grand Duke and the Princess believed that all this beauty was in their honour, no less than the chorus of the bells floating across the tree tops from the city. "This is the best of all," said Ferdinand, as they seated themselves by the stream. "I had no idea marriage was such fun, and they haven't even forgotten the trout," he cried, peering over the brink. "Can you make daisy chains?" asked the princess timidly. He could not, so she taught him, feeling secretly proud that there was something he could learn of her. When the chain was finished, he flung it over his neck and kissed her. "Though I don't like kissing as a rule," he explained. "And this shall be my wedding present," said she. "Why, I brought you 6 wagon loads, beauties, all chosen by my chancellor." "But he didn't make or choose this one," said Sophia, "and I like this one best." They sat silent for a moment. "Dear me," she sighed, "what a lot we have to learn of each other's ways. Hello!" Ferdinand was staring down the glade. "What's that line at the end there across the sky?" Sophia turned. "I think that's the sea. Yes, there is a ship upon it. But why have they hung a blue cloth in front of it? I expect that's in our honour too." They took hands and trotted to the end of the orchard, and there, beyond the hedge, ran a canal, and beyond the canal a wide flat country stretched away to the sea, a land dotted with windmills and cattle and red and white houses with weathercocks, a land, too, criss-crossed with canals, whereon dozens of boats and even some large ships threaded their way like dancers in and out of the groups of cattle, or sailed past a house so closely as almost to poke a bowsprit through the front door. The weathercocks spun and glittered, the windmills waved their arms, the boats bowed and curtsied to the children. Never was such a salutation. Even the blue cloth in the distance twinkled, and Ferdinand saw at a glance that it was embroidered with silver. But the finest flash of all came from a barge moored in the canal just below them, where a middle-aged woman sat scouring a copper pan. "Good day!" cried Ferdinand across the hedge. "Why are you doing that?" "Why, in honour of the wedding, to be sure. Must show one's best at such times, if only for one's own satisfaction." Then, as he climbed into view and helped Sophia over the hedge, she recognized them, and dropping her pan with a clatter, called on the saints to bless them and keep them always. The bridal pair clambered down to the towpath, and from the towpath to her cabin, where she fed them, for they were hungry by this time, with bread and honey from a marvellous cupboard, painted all over with tulips. In short, they enjoyed themselves immensely. "Only," said Ferdinand, "I wish they hadn't covered up the sea, for I wanted a good look at it." "The sea?" said the barge woman, all of a shiver. Then she explained that her 2 sons had been drowned in it. "Though, to be sure," said she, "they died for your Majesty's honour, and if God should give them back to me, would do so again." "For me?" exclaimed Sophia, opening her eyes very wide. "Ay, to be sure, my dear. So it's no wonder, that I should love you." By the time they said good-bye to her and hurried back through the orchard, a dew was gathering on the grass, and a young moon had poised herself above the apple boughs. The birds here were silent, but high on the stone terrace, when they reached it, a solitary one began to sing. From the bright windows facing the terrace came the clatter of plates and glasses, with loud outbursts of laughter. But this bird had chosen his station beneath a dark window at the corner, and sang there unseen. It was the nightingale. They could not understand what he sang. "It is my window," whispered Sophia, and began to weep in the darkness, without knowing why, for she was not miserable in the least, but, on the contrary, very, very happy. They listened hand in hand by a fountain on the terrace. Through the windows they could see the papal legate chatting at table with the king, Sophia's father, and the chancellor hobnobbing with the cardinal archbishop. Only the Queen of YSSELMONDE sat at the table with her wrists on the arms of her throne, and her eyes looking out into the darkness, as though she caught some whisper of the bird's song. But the children knew that he sang for them, not for her, for he told of all the adventures of the day. and he told not as I am telling them, but so beautifully that the heart ached to hear. Yet his song was of 2 words only: young, 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 love, love, love. The same words, over and over. A courtier came staggering out from the banqueting hall, and the bird flew away. The children standing by the fountain watched him as he found the water and dipped his face in it, with a groan. He was exceedingly drunk, but as he lifted his head he caught sight of them in the moonlight and excused himself. "In your Highness's honour," he assured them. "Been doing my best." "Poor man," said Sophia, "but how loyal!" End of section 19.
Section 20 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. England. At Madeira, 7 of us were added to the first-class passengers of the Cambuscan, homeward bound from Cape Town, and even so the company made a poor muster in the saloon, which required 170 feet of hurricane deck for covering. Those were days, long before the South African War, before the Jameson raid even, when every ship carried out a load of miners from the Transvaal and returned comparatively empty, though as a rule with plenty of obviously rich men and be-diamonded ladies. But every tide has its backwash, and it so happened that the Cambuscan held as many second and third class passengers as she could stow. They were, their general air proclaimed it, the failures of South African immigration. Men and women who had gone out too early and given up the struggle just when the propitious moment arrived. Seediness marked the second class. The third class came from all parts, from the Cape to Pietermaritzburg, but they might have conspired to assemble on the Cambuscan as a protest against high hopes and dreams of a promised land. The protest, let me add, was an entirely passive one. They stood aloof, watching the flashy gaieties of the hurricane deck from their own sad penumbra, a dejected, wistful, whispering throng. "They simply don't occur," one of the be-diamonded ladies remarked to me, and went on to praise the U-line for arranging it so. With nightfall or a trifle later they vanished, and at most, when the time came for my last pipe before turning in, 2 or 3 figures would be left pacing there forward, pacing and turning and pacing again. I wondered who these figures were, and what their thoughts. They and the sleepers hive beneath them belonged to another world, a world driven with ours through wave and darkness, urged by the same propellers, controlled by the same helmsman, separated only by thin partitions which the touch of a rock would tear down like paper, and yet, while the partitions stood, separated as no city separates its rich and poor. Only on Sundays did these 2 worlds consent to meet. They had, it appeared, a common God, and joined for a few minutes once a week in worshipping him. The be-diamonded lady, however, was not quite accurate. Once and once only, it was the second day out from Madeira, the third-class passengers did occur, to the extent of organizing athletic sports, and even, with the captain's leave, of levying prize money from the saloon deck. Some 4 or 5 of us, when their delegate approached, were lounging beneath the great awning and listening, or pretending to listen, to the discourse of our only millionaire, Mr. Olstein. As usual, he recited his wrongs. and, as usual, the mere recital caused him to perspire. The hairs on the back of his expostulatory hand bristled with indignation. The diamonds on his fingers flashed with it. We had known him but 2 days, and were passing weary of him, but allowed him to talk. He apostrophized the British flag. His final court of appeal, he termed it, while we stared out over the waters. "We love it," he insisted. "We never see it without a lump in our throats. But we ask ourselves, how long is this affection to count for nothing? What are we to get in return?" No one answered, perhaps because no one knew. My thoughts had flown forward to a small riverside church in England, and a memorial window to one whose body had been found after Isandlwana, with the same flag wrapped around it beneath the tunic. This was his reward. "Hey, what's this?" Mr. Olstein took the subscription list, fitted his gold-rimmed glasses, and eyed the delegate over the paper. "Athletic sports? Not much in your line, I should say." "No, sir." And while the delegate bent his eyes, a bright spot showed on either cheek. He was a weedy, hollow-chested man, about 6 feet in height, with telltale pits at the back of the neck, and a ragged beard evidently grown on the voyage. "I'm only a collector, with the captain's permission." "I see." Mr. Olstein pulled out a sovereign. "I don't put this on you. Mind, I can tell a consumptive with half an eye. See here," he appealed to us. "This is just what we suffer from. You fellows with lung trouble flock to a tapered hole like Madeira, while the Cape would cure you in half the time. Why, the voyage itself only begins to be decent after you get south. But you won't see it, and the people who do see it are just the sort who don't pay us when they come and damage us when they go back. Hard cases sent out to pick up a living as well as their health, who get stranded and hurry home half cured." A young Briton in the deck chair next to mine rose and walked off abruptly, while I fumbled for a coin, ashamed to meet the collector's eye. "Hullo!" Mr. Olstein grinned at me. "Our friend's in a hurry to dodge the subscription list." But the young Briton turned and intercepted the collector as he moved towards the next group. "It's your sovereign," said I, "that seems to be overlooked." Mr. Olstein saw it at his elbow and repocketed it. "Well, if he hasn't the sense to pick it up, I've some more than to whistle him back. But that'll show you the sort of fool we send out to compete with Germans and such like. It's enough to make a man ashamed of his country." This happened on a Saturday morning, and in the afternoon we attended the sports, a depressing ceremony. The performers went through their contests, so to speak, with bated breath and a self-consciousness which, try as we might, poisoned our applause and made it insufferably patronizing. Their backers would pluck up heart and encourage them loudly with Whitechapel catchwords, and anon would hush their voices in uneasy shame. Our collector, brave by fits in his dignity as steward, would catch the eye of a saloon-deck passenger and shrink behind the enormous rosette which some wag had pinned upon him. Next day I made an opportunity to speak with him after service. It needed no pressing to extract his story, and he told it with entire simplicity. He was a Cockney, and by trade had been a baker in Bermondsey. "A wearing trade," he said. "The most of us die before 40. You'd be surprised." But he had started with a sound constitution, and somehow persuaded himself, in spite of warnings, that he was immune. At 32 he had married, a deal later than most, he explained, and had scarcely been married 3 months before lung trouble declared itself. "I 'ad a few pounds put by, having married so late, and it seemed a duty to Emily to give myself every chance. So we packed up almost at once and started for South Africa. It was a wrench to her, but the voyage out did us both all the good in the world, she being in a delicate state of health, and the room in Bermondsey not fit for a woman in that condition. The baby was born in Cape Town 5 months after their landing, but they've no employment for bakers out there," he assured me. "We found trade very low altogether, and what I picked up wasn't any healthier than in London. Emily disliked the place too, though she'd have stayed gladly if it had been doing me any good. And so back we're going. There's one thing, I'm safe of work. My old employer in Bermondsey has promised that all right, and the child, you see, sir, won't suffer. There's no consumption, that I know of, in either of our families, and Emily, you may be sure, will see he's not brought up to be a baker." He announced it in the most matter-of-fact way. He was going back to England to die speedily, and he knew it. "I should like you to see our baby, sir," he added. "He weighs extraordinary for his age. My wife comes from the north of England, a very big-boned family, and he's British, every ounce of him, though he was born in South Africa." But the wife took a chill on entering the bay, and remained below with the child. Nor was it until the day we sighted England that I saw the whole family together. We were to pick up the Eddystone, and as this was calculated to happen at sunset or a little after, the usual sweepstake on the saloon deck aroused a little more than the usual excitement. For the first glimpse, whether of lighthouse or light, would give the prize to the nearest guesser. If we anticipated sunset, the clearness of the weather would decide between the two pretty close shots. If we ran it fine, the lamp, which carries for 17 miles and more, might upset those who staked on daylight, even at that distance from the mark. Our guesses had been tabulated, and the paper pinned up in the smoking room. They allowed a margin of some 25 knots on the 24 hours' run, ranging, as nearly as I can recollect, from 335 to 360, and the date being the last week of March, and sunset falling close on 6:30, a whole nebula of guesses surrounded that hour, one or two divided only by a few seconds. A strong headwind met us in the channel, and the backers of daylight had almost given up hope. But it dropped in the late afternoon, and by the log we were evidently in for a close finish. Mr. Olstein had set his watch by the ship's chronometer, and consulted it from minute to minute. He stood by me, binocular in hand, and grew paler with excitement as sunset drew on, and the minutes scored off the guesses one by one from the list. His guess was among the last, but not actually the last by half a dozen. We had reached a point when 5 minutes disposed of no less than 9 guesses. The weather was dull. No one could tell precisely if the sun had sunk or not. We were certainly within 20 miles of the rock, and by the Nautical almanac, unless our chronometer erred, the light ought to flash out within 60 seconds. If within 40 the man sang out from the crow's nest, Mr. Olstein would lose. After 40 he had a whole minute and a half for a clear win. The 40 seconds passed. Mr. Olstein drew a long breath of relief. "But why the devil don't they light up?" he demanded after a moment. "I called you to witness what the time is by our chronometer. I'll have it tested as soon as I step ashore, and if it's wrong, I'll complain to the company. If it's not, I'll send the Trinity House a letter'll lay those lighthouse fellows by the heels. Punctuality, sir, in the case of shipping, life or death." The cry of the man in the crow's nest mingled with ours as a spark touched the northeastern horizon almost ahead of us, trembled and died, shone out as it seemed more steadily, and again was quenched. Mr. Olstein slapped his thigh. He had won something like £10 and was a joyous millionaire. "That makes twice in 4 voyages," he proclaimed. I congratulated him and strode forward. A group of third-class passengers had gathered by the starboard bow. They too had heard the cry. To all appearance they might have been an ordinary Whitechapel crowd, and even now they scarcely lifted their voices, but they whispered and pointed. The Eddystone. I singled out my friend the baker. Before I could reach him, he had broken from the group. I hailed him. Without seeming to hear, he disappeared down the fore companion, but by and by he emerged again, and with a baby in his arms. Evidently he had torn it from its cot. His wife followed, weak and protesting. The child, too, raised a wail of querulous protest, but he hugged it to him, and running to the ship's side, held it aloft. "England, baby!" It turned its head, seeking the pillow or its mother, and would not look, but broke into fresh and louder wailing. "England!" He hugged it afresh. God knows of what feeling sprang the tears that fell on its face and baptized it, but he hushed his voice, and lifting the child again, coaxed it to look. Coaxed it with tears streaming now, and with a thrill that would not be denied. "England, baby! England!" End of section 20. Section 21 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. John and the Ghosts. In the kingdom of Illyria there lived not long ago a poor woodcutter with 3 sons, who in time went forth to seek their fortunes. At the end of 3 years they returned by agreement to compare their progress in the world. The eldest had become a lawyer, and the second a merchant, and each of these had won riches and friends. But John, the youngest, who had enlisted in the army, could only show a cork leg and a medal. "You have made a bad business of it," said his brothers. "Your medal is worthless except to a collector of such things, and your leg is a positive disadvantage. Fortunately, we have influence, and since you are our brother, we must see what we can do for you." Now the king of Illyria lived at that time in his capital in a brick palace at the end of the great park. He kept this park open to all, and allowed no one to build in it. But the richest citizens, who were so fond of their ruler that they could not live out of his sight, had their houses just beyond the park, in the rear of the palace, on a piece of ground which they called Palace Gardens. The name was a little misleading, for the true gardens lay in front of the palace, where children of all classes played among the trees and flower beds and artificial ponds, and the king sat and watched them, because he took delight in children, and because the sight of them cheered his only daughter, who had fallen into a deep melancholy. But the rich citizens clung to it, for it gave a pleasant neighbourly air to their roadway, and showed what friendliness there was between the monarch of Illyria and his people. At either end you entered the roadway, if you were allowed, by an iron gate, and each gate had a sentry box beside it, and a tall beadle, and a notice board to save him the trouble of explanation, and the notice ran, "Private. The beadle has orders to refuse admittance to all wagons, tradesmen's carts, hackney coaches, donkeys, beggars, disorderly characters, or persons carrying burdens." A sedentary life had told so severely upon one of the 2 beadles that he could no longer enter his box with dignity, or read his newspaper there with any comfort. He resigned, and John obtained the post by his brother's interest, in spite of his cork leg. He had now a bright green suit with scarlet pipings, a gold laced hat, a fashionable address, and very little to do. But the army had taught him to be active, and for lack of anything better he fell into deep thinking. This came near to bringing him into trouble. One evening he looked out of his sentry box and saw a mild and somewhat sad-featured old gentleman approaching the gate. "No admittance," said John. "Tut, tut," said the old gentleman. "I'm the king." John looked at the face on his medal, and sure enough there was a resemblance. "But all the same, your majesty carries a burden." Here he pointed to the notice board. "And the folks along this road are mighty particular." The king smiled and then sighed heavily. "It's about the princess, my daughter," said he. "She has not smiled for a whole year." "I'll warrant I'd make her," said John. "I'll warrant you could not," said the king. "She will never smile again until she is married." "Then," answered John, "speaking in a humble way as becomes me, why the dickens alive don't you marry her up and get done with it?" The king shook his head. "There's a condition attached," said he. "Maybe you've heard of the famous haunted house in Punsby Square." "I've always gone by the spelling and pronounced it Ponsonby," said John. "Well, the condition is that every suitor for my daughter's hand must spend a night alone in that house, and if he survives and is ready to persevere with his wooing, he must return a year later with his bride and spend the night of his marriage there." "And very handy," said John, "for there's a wedding cake shop at the corner." The king sighed again. "Unhappily none survive. 155 have undertaken the adventure, and not a man of them but has either lost his wits or run for it." "Well," said John, "I've been afraid of a great many men." "That's a poor confession for a soldier," put in the king, "when they all happen to come at me together. But I've never yet met a ghost that could frighten me, and if your majesty will give me the latchkey, I'll try my luck this very night." It could not be done in this free and easy way, but at 8 o'clock, after John had visited the palace and taken an oath in the princess's presence, which was his first sight of her, he was driven down to the house beside the Lord Chamberlain, who admitted him to the black front hall, and slamming the door upon him, scuttled out of the porch as quickly as possible and into his brougham. John struck a match, and as he did so he heard the carriage roll away. The walls were bare, and the floor and great staircase ahead of him carpetless. As the match flickered out, he caught a glimpse of a pair of feet moving up the stairs. That was all, only feet. "I'll catch up with the calves on the landing, maybe," said he, and striking another match he followed them up. The feet turned aside on the landing and led him into a room on the right. He paused on the threshold, drew a candle from his pocket, lit it, and stared about him. The room was of great size, bare and dusty, with crimson hangings, gilt panels, and one huge gilt chandelier, from which and from the ceiling and cornice long cobwebs trailed down like creeping plants. Beneath the chandelier a dark smear ran along the boards. The feet crossed it towards the fireplace, and as they did so, John saw them stained with blood. They reached the fireplace and vanished. Scarcely had this happened before the end of the room opposite the window began to glow with an unearthly light. John, whose poverty had taught him to be economical, promptly blew out his candle. A moment later, 2 men entered, bearing a coffin between them. They rested it upon the floor, and seating themselves upon it, began to cast dice. "Your soul, my soul," they kept saying in hollow tones, according as they won or lost. At length, one of them, a tall man in a powdered wig, with a face extraordinarily pale, flung a hand to his brow, rose and staggered from the room. The other sat waiting and twirling his black moustache, with an evil smile. John, who by this time had found a seat in a far corner, thought him the most poisonous-looking villain he had ever seen. But as the minutes passed and nothing happened, he turned his back to the light and pulled out a penny dreadful. His literary taste was shocking, and when it came to romance, he liked the incidents to follow one another with great rapidity. He was interrupted by a blood-curdling groan, and the first ruffian broke into the room, dragging by its grey locks the body of an old man. A young girl followed, weeping and protesting, with dishevelled hair, and behind her entered a priest with a brazier full of glowing charcoal. The girl cast herself forward on the old man's body, but the two scoundrels dragged her from it by force. "The money!" demanded the dark one, and she drew from her bosom a small key and cast it at his feet. "My promise!" demanded the other, and seized her by the wrist as the priest stepped forward. "Quick, over this coffin, man and wife!" She wrenched her hand away and thrust him backward. The priest retreated to the brazier and drew out a red-hot iron. John thought it about time to interfere. "I beg your pardon," said he, stepping forward, "but I suppose you really are ghosts." "We are unhallowed souls," answered the dark man impressively, "who return to blight the living with the spectacle of our awful crimes." "Meaning me?" asked John. "Aye, sir, and to destroy you tonight, if you contract not upon your soul to return with your bride and meet us here a 12-month hence." Said John to himself. "They are 3 to 1, and after all, it's what I came for, I suppose." He added aloud, "Some form of document is usual in these cases." The dark man drew out a pen and parchment. "Hold forth your hand," he commanded, and as John held it out, thinking he meant to shake it over the bargain, the fellow drove the pen into his wrist until the blood spurted. "Now sign." "Sign," said the other villain. "Sign," said the lady. "Oh, very well, miss, if you're in this swindle too. My mind is easier," said John, and signed his name with a flourish. "But a bargain is a bargain, and what security have I for your part in it?" "Our signature," said the priest terribly, at the same moment pressing his branding iron into John's ankle. A smell of burnt cork arose as John stooped and clapped his hand over the scorched stocking. When he looked up again, his visitors had vanished, and a moment later the strange light, too, died away. But the coffin remained for evidence that he had not been dreaming. John lit a candle and examined it. "Just the thing for me," he exclaimed, finding it to be a mere shell of pine boards, loosely nailed together and painted black. I was beginning to shiver. He knocked the coffin to pieces, crammed them into the fireplace, and very soon had a grand fire blazing, before which he sat and finished his penny dreadful, and so dropped off into a sound sleep. The Lord Chamberlain arrived early in the morning, and finding him stretched there, at first broke into lamentations over the fate of yet another personable young man, but soon changed his tune when John sat up, and, rubbing his eyes, demanded to be told the time. "But are you really alive? We must drive back and tell his Majesty at once." "Stay a moment," said John. "There is a brother of mine, a lawyer, in the city. He'll be arriving at his office about this time, and you must drive me there, for I have a document here of a sort, and must have it stamped to be on the safe side." So into the city he was driven beside the Lord Chamberlain, and there had his leg stamped and filed for reference, and having purchased another, was conveyed to the palace, where the king received him with open arms. He was now a favoured guest at the court, and had frequent opportunities of seeing and conversing with the princess, with whom he soon fell deeply in love. But as the months passed, and the time drew near for their marriage, he grew silent and thoughtful, for he feared to expose her, even in his company, to the sights he had witnessed in the haunted house. He thought and thought, until one fine afternoon he snapped his fingers suddenly, and after that went about whistling. A fortnight before the day fixed for the wedding, he drove into the city again, but this time to the office of his other brother, the merchant. "I want," he said, "a loan of £1,000. "Nothing easier," said his brother. "Here are 850. Of the remainder I shall keep 50 as interest for the first year at 5%. And the odd 100 should purchase a premium of insurance for £2,000, which I will retain as security against accidents." This seemed not only fair, but brotherly. John pocketed his £850, shook his creditor affectionately by the hand, and hurried westward. The marriage was celebrated with great pomp, and in the evening the king, who had been shedding tears at intervals throughout the ceremonies, accompanied his daughter to the haunted house. The princess was pale. John, on the contrary, who sat facing her father in the state coach, smiled with a cheerfulness which, under the circumstances, seemed a trifle ill-bred. The wedding guests followed in 24 chariots. Their cards of invitation had said 2 to 5:30 p.m., and it was now 8 o'clock, but they could not resist the temptation to see the last of the poor dear thing, as they agreed to call the bride. The king sat silent during the drive. He was preparing his farewell speech, which he meant to deliver on the porch, but arriving and perceiving a crowd about it, and also, to his vast astonishment, a red baize carpet on the perron, and a butler bowing in the doorway with 2 footmen behind him, he coughed down his exordium and led his daughter into the hall amid showers of rice and confetti. The bridegroom followed, and so did the wedding guests, since no one opposed them. The hall and staircase were decorated with palms and pot plants, flags and emblems of Illyria, and in the great drawing-room which they entered, while John persuaded the king to a seat, they found many rows of morocco-covered chairs, a miniature stage with a drop representing the play scene in Hamlet, a row of footlights, a boudoir grand piano, and a man seated at the keyboard whom they recognized as a performer in much demand at suburban dances. The company had scarcely seated itself before a strange light began to illuminate the end of the room at which the stage stood, and immediately the curtain rose to the overture of M. Offenbach's Orphée aux Enfers, the pianist continuing with great spirit until a round of applause greeted the entrance of the 2 spectral performers. Its effect upon them was in the highest degree disconcerting. They sat down the coffin, and after a brief and hurried conference in an undertone, the black mustachioed ghost advanced to the footlights, singled out John from the audience, and with a terrific scowl demanded to know the reason of this extraordinary gathering. "Come, come, my dear sir," answered John. "Our contract, if you will study it, allows me to invite whom I choose. It merely insists that my bride and I must be present. As you see, we are. Pray go on with your part, and assure yourself it is no use trying the high horse with me." The dark ghost looked at his partner, who shuffled uneasily. "I told you," said he, "we should have trouble with this fellow. I had a presentiment of it when he came to spend the night here without bringing a bulldog. That frightening of the bulldog out of his wits has always been our most effective bit of business." Hereupon the dark ghost took another tone. "Our fair but unfortunate victim has a sore throat tonight," he announced. "The performance is consequently postponed," and he seated himself sulkily upon the coffin, when the limelight man from the wings promptly bathed him in a flood of the most beautiful rose colour. "Oh, this is intolerable!" he exclaimed, starting to his feet. "It is not first-rate, I agree," said John. "But such as it is, we had better get through with it. Should the company doubt its genuineness, I can go around afterwards and show the brand on the cork." Here he tapped the leg which he had been careful to bring with him. Before this evidence of contract, the ghost's resistance collapsed. They seated themselves on the coffin and began the casting of dice. The performance proceeded, but in a half-hearted and perfunctory manner, notwithstanding the vivacious efforts of the limelight man. The tall ghost struck his brow and fled from the stage. There were cries of "Call him back!" but John explained that this was part of the drama and no encores would be allowed, whereupon the audience fell to hissing the villain, who now sat alone with the most lifelike expression of malignity. "Oh, hang it!" he expostulated after a while. "I am doing this under protest, and you need not make it worse for a fellow. I draw the line at hissing." "It's the usual thing," explained John affably. But when the ghostly lady walked on, and in the act of falling on her father's body was interrupted by the pianist, who handed up an immense bouquet, the performers held another hurried colloquy. "Look here," said the dark-browed villain, stepping forward and addressing John, "what will you take to call it quits?" "I'll take," said John, "the key which the lady has just handed you, and if the treasure is at all commensurate with the fuss you've been making about it, we'll let bygones be bygones." Well, it did, and John, having counted it out behind the curtain, came forward and asked the pianist to play "God Save the King," and so, having bowed his guest to the door, took possession of the haunted house, and lived in it many years with his bride, in high renown and prosperity. End of section 21.
Section 22 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian, Hendrie. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Quiller-Couch. Section 22. 3 photographs. Photograph all the prisoners? But why? Demanded Sir Felix Williams. Old Canon Kemp shrugged his shoulders. Admiral Truebody turned the pages of the Home Secretary's letter. They sat at the baize-covered table in the magistrates' room, the last of the visiting justices who met under the old regime to receive the governor's report and look after the welfare of the prisoners in Tregarrick County Gaol. But why, in the name of common sense? Sir Felix persisted. I suppose, hazarded the Admiral, it helps the police in identifying criminals. But the letter says all the prisoners. You don't seriously tell me that anyone wants a photograph to identify poacher Trusise, whom I've committed a score of times if I've committed him once. And perhaps you'll explain to me this further demand for a composite photograph of all the prisoners, male and female. A composite photograph. Have you ever seen one? No, the Admiral mused, but I see what the Home Office is driving at. Someone has been persuading them to test these new theories in criminology the doctors are so busy with, especially in Italy. In Italy? Psst, Sir Felix Williams. My dear Sir Felix, science has no nationality. The Admiral was a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, and kept a microscope to amuse his leisure. It has some proper limits, I should hope, Sir Felix retorted. It annoyed him, a chairman of quarter sessions for close upon 20 years, to be told that the science of criminology was yet in its infancy, and he glanced mischievously at the Canon, who might be supposed to have a professional quarrel with scientific men. But the Canon was a wary fighter, and no waster of powder and shot. Well, well, said he, I don't see what harm it can do, or what good. If the Home Secretary wants his composite photograph, let him have it. The only question is, have we a photographer who knows how to make one? Let him have it. The only question is, have we a photographer who knows how to make one? Or must we send the negatives up to Whitehall? So the visiting justices sent for the local photographer and consulted him, and he, being a clever fellow, declared it was easy enough, a mere question of care in superimposing the negatives. He had never actually made the experiment, his clients, so he called his customers, preferring to be photographed singly or in family groups, but he asked to be given a trial, and suggested, to be on the safe side, preparing 2 or 3 of these composite prints, between which the justices might choose at their next meeting. This was resolved, and the resolution entered in the minutes, and next day the photographer set to work. Some of the prisoners resisted and made faces in front of the camera, squinting and pulling the most horrible mouths. A female shoplifter sat under protest because she was not allowed to send home for an evening gown. But the most consented obediently, and Jim Tresize even asked for a copy to take home to his wife. The Admiral, who had married late in life, resided with his wife and young family in a neat villa just outside the town, where his hobby was to grow pelargoniums. The photographer passed the gate daily on his way to and from the prison, and was usually hailed and catechised on his progress. His patience with the recalcitrant prisoners delighted the Admiral, who more than once assured his wife that Smithers was an intelligent fellow and quite an artist in his way. "I wonder how he manages it," said Mrs. Trewbody. "He told baby last autumn that a little bird would fly out of the camera when he took off the cap, and everyone allows that the result is most lifelike. But I don't like the idea, and I think it may injure his trade." The Admiral could not always follow his wife's reasoning. "What is it you dislike?" he asked. "Well, it's not nice to think of oneself going into the same camera he's been using on those wretched prisoners. It's sentiment, I dare say, but I had the same feeling when he stuck up Harry's photograph in his showcase at the railway station among all kinds of objectionable persons, and I requested him to remove it." The Admiral laughed indulgently, being one of those men who find a charm, even a subtle flattery, in their wife's silliness. "I agree with you," he said, "that it's not pleasant to be exposed to public gaze among a crowd of people one would never think of knowing. I don't suppose it would actually encourage familiarity. At the same time, there's an air of promiscuity about it, I won't say disrespect, which jars. But with the prisoners it's different. My attitude to them is scientific, if I may say so. I look upon them as a race apart, almost of another world, and as such I find them extremely interesting. The possibility of mixing with them on any terms of intimacy doesn't occur. I'm aware, my dear," he wound up graciously, "that you women seldom understand this mental detachment, being by nature unscientific, and all the more charming for your prejudices." At the next meeting of justices, Smithers the photographer presented himself, and produced his prints with a curious air of diffidence. "I have," he explained, "brought 3 for your worship's selection, and can honestly assure your worships that my pains have been endless. What puzzles me, however, is that although in all 3 the same portraits have been imposed, and in the same order, the results are surprisingly different. The cause of these differences I cannot detect, though I have gone over the process several times and step by step. But out of some 24 experiments, I may say that all the results answer pretty closely to one or another of these 3 types." Mr. Smithers, who had spent much time in rehearsing this little speech, handed up photograph number 1, and Sir Felix adjusted his spectacles. "Villainous!" he exclaimed, recoiling. The Canon and the Admiral bent over it together. "Most repulsive," said the Admiral. "Here indeed," the Canon was more impressive. "Here indeed is an object lesson in the effects of crime. Is it possible that to this man's passions can degrade his divinely inherited features? Were it not altogether too horrible, I would have this picture framed and glazed and hung up in every cottage home in the land." "My dear fellow," interrupted Sir Felix, "we cannot possibly let this monstrosity go up to Whitehall as representative of the inmates of Tregarrick Gaol. It would mean an inquiry on the spot. It would even reflect upon us. Ours is a decent county as counties go, and I protest it shall not, with my consent, be injured by any such libel." Mr. Smithers handed up photograph number 2. "This looks better," began Sir Felix, and with that he gave a slight start, and passed the photograph to the Canon. The Canon too started, and stole a quick glance at Sir Felix. Their eyes met. "It certainly is singular," stammered Sir Felix. "I fancied, without irreverence, But you detected it too? He wound up incoherently. May I have a look? The Admiral peered over the Canon's hand, who, however, did not relinquish the photograph, but turned on Smithers with sudden severity. I presume, sir, this is not an audacious joke? I assure your worship, protested the photographer, I had some thoughts of tearing it up, but thought it wouldn't be honest. You did rightly, the Canon answered, but now that we have seen it, I have no such scruple. He tore the print across and across again. Even in this, he said, with a glance at the Admiral, who winced, we may perhaps read a lesson, or at least a warning, that man's presumption in extending the bounds of his knowledge, or as I should prefer to call it, his curiosity, may bring him face to face with... But the Canon's speech tailed off as he regarded the torn pieces of cardboard in his hand. He felt that the others had been seriously perturbed and were not listening. He himself was conscious of a shock too serious for that glib emollient usually so efficacious, the sound of his own voice. He perceived that it did not impose even on the photographer. An uncomfortable silence fell on the room. Sir Felix was the first to recover. Put it in the waste paper basket. No, in the fire, he commanded, and turned to Smithers. Surely between these two extremes... I was on the point of suggesting that your worships would find number 3 more satisfactory, the photographer interrupted, forgetting his manners in his anxiety to restore these 3 gentlemen to their ease. His own discomfort was acute, and he overacted, as a man will who has unwittingly surprised a state secret and wishes to assure everyone of his obtuseness. Sir Felix studied number 3. This appears to me a very ordinary photograph. Without being positively displeasing, the face is one you might pass in the street any day and forget. I hope it suggests no well-known features, put in the Canon nervously. None at all, I think, but see for yourself. To me it seems, although hazy of course, the kind of thing the Home Office might find helpful. It is less distinct than the others. The Admiral pulled his whiskers. And for that reason the more obviously composite, which is what we are required to furnish. No, indeed, I can find nothing amiss with it, and I think, gentlemen, if you are agreed, we will forward this print. Number 3 was passed accordingly. The photographer withdrew, and the 3 justices turned to other business, which occupied them for a full 2 hours. But I pray you, mark the sequel. Mr. Smithers, in his relief and delight at the magistrate's approbation, hurried home, fished out a copy of number 3, exposed it proudly in his shop window, and went off to the Packhorse Inn for a drink. Less than an hour later, Mrs. Trewbody, having packed her family into the jingle for their afternoon's ride with Miss Platt, the governess, strolled down into the town to do some light shopping, and, happening to pass the photographer's window, came to a standstill with a little gasp. A moment later she entered the shop, and Mrs. Smithers, answering the shop bell, found that she had taken the photograph from the window and was examining it eagerly. This is quite a surprise, Mrs. Smithers. A capital photograph. May I ask how many copies my husband ordered? I'm not aware, ma'am, that the Admiral has ordered any as yet, though I heard Smithers say only this morning as he hoped he'd be pleased with it. I think I can answer for that, although he is particular, but I happen to know he disapproves of these things being exposed in the window. I'll take this copy home with me, if I may. Has your husband printed any more? Well, no, ma'am. There was one other copy, but Lady Felix Williams happened to be passing just now and spied it, and nothing would do but she must take it away with her. Lady Felix Williams? Mrs. Trewbody stiffened with sudden distrust. Now what would Lady Felix Williams want with this? I'm sure I can't tell you, ma'am, but she was delighted. A capital likeness, she said. I've never seen a photograph before that caught just that expression of his. I should very much like to know what she has to do with his expression, Mrs. Trewbody murmured to herself, between wonder and incipient alarm. But she concealed her feelings, good lady, and having paid for her purchase, carried it home in her muff, and stuck it upright against one of the Sèvres candlesticks on her boudoir mantel-shelf. And there the Admiral discovered it 3/4 of an hour later. He came home wanting his tea, and finding the boudoir empty, advanced to ring the bell. At that moment his eyes fell on Smithers' replica of the very photograph he had passed for furtherance to the Home Secretary. He picked it up and gave vent to a long whistle, Now how the dickens—" His wife appeared in the doorway, with Harry, Dicky, and Theophila clinging to her skirts, fresh from their ride and boisterous. "My dear Emily, where in the world did you get hold of this?" He held the photograph towards her at arm's length, and the children rushed forward to examine it. "Papa, papa!" they shouted together, capering around it. "Oh, mammy, isn't it him exactly?" End of section 22. Section 23 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian, Hendrie. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Quiller-Couch. Section 23. The Talking Ships. He was a happy boy, for he lived beside a harbour, and just below the last bend where the river swept out of the steep woodlands into view of the sea, a half-ruined castle with a battery of antiquated guns still made believe to protect the entrance to the harbour, and looked across it upon a ridge of rocks surmounted by a wooden cross, which the Trinity pilots kept in repair. Between the cross and the fort, for as long as he could remember, a procession of ships had come sailing in to anchor by the great red buoy immediately beneath his nursery window. They belonged to all nations, and hailed from all imaginable ports, and from the day his nurse had first stood him upon a chair to watch them, these had been the great interest of his life. He soon came to know them all, French brigs and chasse-marées, Russian fore and afters, Dutch billy boys, galliots from the east coast, and Thames hay barges with vanes and windboards. He could tell you why the Italians were deep in the keel, why the Danes were manned by youngsters, and why these youngsters deserted, although their skippers looked, and indeed were, such good-natured fellows. What food the French crews hunted in the seaweed under the cliff, and when the Baltic traders would be driven southward by the ice. Once acquainted with a vessel, he would recognise her at any distance, though by what signs he could no more tell than we why we recognise a friend. On his 7th birthday he was given a sailing boat, on condition that he learned to read. But although he kept by the bargain honestly, at the end of a month he handled her better than he was likely to handle his book in a year. He had a companion and instructor, of course, a pensioner who had left the navy to become in turn fisherman, yachtsman, able seaman on board a dozen sailing vessels, and now yachtsman again. His name was Billy, and he taught the boy many mysteries, from the tying of knots to the reading of weather signs, how to beach a boat, how to take a conger off the hook, how to gaff a cuttle and avoid its ink. In return, the boy gave him his heart, and even something like worship. One fine day, as they tacked to and fro a mile and more from the harbour's mouth, whiffing for mackerel, the boy looked up from his seat by the tiller. "I say, Billy, did you speak?" Billy, seated on the thwart and leaning with both arms on the weather gunwale, turned his head lazily. "Not a word this half hour," he answered. "Well now, I thought not, but somebody or something spoke just now." The boy blushed, for Billy was looking at him quizzically. "It's not the first time I've heard it either," he went on. "Sometimes it sounds right astern, and sometimes close beside me." "What does it say?" asked Billy, relighting his pipe. "I don't know that it says anything, and yet it seems to speak out quite clearly. 5 or 6 times I've heard it, and usually on smooth days like this, when the wind's steady." Billy nodded. "That's right, sonny. I've heard it scores of times, and they say— but there, I don't believe a word of it." "What do they say?" "They say that 'tis the voice of drowned men down below, and that they hail their names whenever a boat passes." The boy stared at the water. He knew it for a floor through which he let down his trammels and crab-pots into Wonderland, a twilight with forests and meadows of its own, in which all the marvels of all the fairy books were possible. But the terror of it had never clouded his delight. Nonsense, Billy. The voice I hear is always quite cheerful and friendly, not a bit like a dead man's." "I tell what I'm told," answered Billy, and the subject dropped. But the boy did not cease thinking about the voice, and some time after he came, as it seemed, upon a clue. His father had set him to read Shakespeare, and taking down the first of 12 volumes from the shelf, he began upon the first play, The Tempest. He was prepared to yawn, but the first scene flung open a door to him, and he stepped into a new world, a childish Ferdinand roaming an Isle of Voices. He resigned Miranda to the grown-up prince, for whom, as he saw at a glance, being wise in the ways of storybooks, she was eminently fitted. It was in Ariel, perched with harp upon the shrouds of the king's ship, that he recognised the unseen familiar of his own voyaging. "O spirit, be my friend, speak to me often." As children will, he gave Prospero's island a local habitation in the tangled cliff garden, tethered Caliban in the tool shed, and watched the white surf far withdrawn, or listened to its murmur between the lordly boles of the red currant bushes. For the first time he became aware of some limitations in Billy. He had long been aware of some serious limitations in his nurse. She could not, for instance, sail a boat, and her only knot was a granny. He never dreamed of despising her, being an affectionate boy, but more and more he went his own way without consulting her. Yet it was she who, unconsciously and quite as if it were nothing out of the way, handed him the clue. A flagstaff stood in the garden on a grassy platform, halfway down the cliffside, and the boy, at his earnest wish, had been given charge of it. On weekdays, as a rule, he hoisted 2 flags, an ensign on the gaff and a single code flag at the masthead. But on Sundays he usually ran up 3 or 4, and with the help of the code book spelt out some message to the harbour. Sometimes, too, if an old friend happened to take up her moorings at the Red Buoy below, he would have her code letters hoisted to welcome her, or would greet and speed her with such signals as KTN, glad to see you, and BRD, or BQR, meaning goodbye. A pleasant passage. Skippers fell into the habit of dipping their flags to him as they were towed out to sea, and a few amused themselves while at anchor by pulling out their bags of bunting and signalling humorous conversations, though their topmasts reached so near to the boy's platform that they might with less labour have talked through a speaking trumpet. One morning before Christmas, 6 vessels lay below at the buoy, moored stern to stern, in 2 tiers of 3, and after hoisting his signal, CPBH, for Christmas Eve, he ran indoors with the news that all 6 were answering with bushes of holly at their topmast heads, while one, a Danish barquentine, had rove stronger halyards and carried a tall fir tree at the main, its branches reaching many feet above her truck. "Christmas is Christmas," said his nurse. "When I was young, at such times there wouldn't be a ship in the harbour without its talking bush." "What is a talking bush?" the boy asked. "And you pretend to be a sailor? Well, well, not to know what happens on Christmas night when the clocks strike 12. The boy's eyes grew round. "Do the ships talk?" "Why, of course they do. For my part, I wonder what Billy teaches you." Late that evening, when the household supposed him to be in bed, the boy crept down through the moonlit garden to the dinghy which Billy had left on its frape under the cliff. But for their riding lights, the vessels at the buoy lay asleep. The crews of the foreigners had turned in. The Nubian, of Runcorn, had no soul on board but a night watchman, now soundly dozing in the forecastle, and the Touch-me-not was deserted. The Touch-me-not belonged to the port, and her skipper, Captain Tangier, looked after her in harbour, when he had paid off all hands. Usually he slept on board, but tonight, after trimming his lamp, he had rowed ashore to spend Christmas with his family, for which, since he owned a majority of the shares, no one was likely to blame him. He had even left the accommodation ladder hanging over her side, to be ready for boarding her in the morning. All this the boy had noted, and accordingly, having pushed across in the dinghy, he climbed the Touch-me-not's ladder, and dropped upon deck with a bundle of rugs and his father's greatcoat under his arm. He looked about him and listened. There was no sound at all but the lap of tide between the ships, and the voice of a preacher travelling over the water from a shed far down the harbour, where the Salvation Army was holding a midnight service. Captain Tangye had snugged down his ship for the night. Ropes were coiled, deckhouses padlocked, the spokes of the wheel covered against dew and frost. The boy found the slack of a stout hawser coiled beneath the taffrail, a circular fort into which he crept with his rugs and nestled down warmly, and then for half an hour lay listening. But only the preacher's voice broke the silence of the harbour. On it went, rising and falling. Away in the little town the church clock chimed the quarter. It must have missed striking the hour, thought the boy, and he peered over the edge of his shelter. The preacher's voice had ceased, but another was speaking, and close beside him. "You'd be surprised," it said, "how simple one's pleasures grow with age. This is the 12th Christmas I've spent at home, and I assure you I quite look forward to it. That's a confession, eh? From one who has sailed under Nelson and smelt powder in his time." The boy knew that he must be listening to the Touch-me-not, whose keelson came from an old line of battleship. "To be sure," the voice went on graciously, "a great deal depends on one's company." "Talking of powder," said the Nubian, creaking gently on her stern moorings, "reminds me of a terrible adventure. My very first voyage was to the mouth of a river on the west coast of Africa, where two native tribes were at war. Somehow my owner, a scoundrelly fellow in the Midlands, had wind of the quarrel, and that the tribe nearest the coast needed gunpowder. We sailed from Cardiff with 1,500 barrels duly labelled, and the natives came out to meet us at the river mouth and rafted them ashore. But the barrels, if you will believe me, held nothing but sifted coal dust. Off we went before the trick was discovered, and with £6,000 worth of ivory in my hold. But the worst villainy was to come, for my owner, pretending that he had opened up a profitable trade, and having his ivory to show for it, sold me to a London firm, who loaded me with real gunpowder and sent me out 6 months later to the same river, but with a new skipper and a different crew. The natives knew me at once, and came swarming out in canoes as soon as we dropped anchor. The captain, who of course suspected nothing, allowed them to crowd on board, and I declare that within 5 minutes they had clubbed him and every man of the crew, and tossed their bodies to the sharks. Then they cut my hawsers and towed me over the river bar, and having landed a good half of my barrels, they built and lit a fire around them in derision. I can hear the explosion still. My poor upper works have been crazy ever since. It destroyed almost all the fighters of the tribe, who had formed a ring to dance around the fire. The rest fled inland, and I never saw them again, but lay abandoned for months as they had anchored me, between the ruined huts and a sandy pit alive with mosquitoes, until somehow a British tramp steamer heard of me at one of the trading stations up the coast. She brought down a crew to man and work me home, but my owner could not pay the salvage, so the parties who owned the steamer, a Runcorn firm, paid him £50 and kept me for their services. A surveyor examined me and reported that I should never be fit for much. The explosion had shaken me to pieces. I might do for the coasting trade, that was all, and in that I've remained." "Owners are rogues for the most part," commented the Danish barkentine, rubbing against the Touch-me-not's fender, as if to nudge her. "There's the Maria Stella Maris yonder, who can tell us a tale of the food they store us with. She went through a mutiny once, I've heard." "I'd rather not talk of it," put in the Italian hastily, and a shudder ran through her timbers. "It's a dreadful recollection, and I have that by my mizzenmast which all the holystone in the world can never scour." "But I've had a mutiny too," said the Dutch galliot, with a voice of great importance, and this time the boy felt sure that the vessels nudged one another. "It happened," the galliot went on, "between my skipper and his vrouw, who was to all purpose our mate, and as good a mate as ever I sailed with, but she would not believe the world was round. The skipper took a Dutch cheese and tried to explain things. He moved the cheese round, as it might be, from west to east, and argued, until at last, being a persevering man, he did really persuade her. But it took a whole voyage, and by the time he succeeded we were near home again, and in the North Sea Canal. The moment she was convinced, what must the woman do but go ashore to an aunt of hers who lived at Zaandam, and refuse to return on board, though her man went on his bended knees to her. "I will not," she said, "and that's flat, at any rate." The poor man had to start afresh, undo every one of his arguments, and prove the earth flat again, before she would trust herself to travel. It cost us a week, but for my part I didn't grudge it. Your cliffs and deep water harbours don't appeal to me. Give me a canal with windmills and summer houses, where you can look in on the families drinking tea as you sail by. Give me above all a canal on Sundays, when the folks walk along the towing path in their best clothes, and you feel as if you were going to church with them. Give me, rather, said the Norwegian bark from Christiansund, a fjord with forests running straight up to the snow mountains, and water so deep that no ship's anchor can reach it. I have seen most waters, the Dane announced calmly and proudly. As you see, I am very particular about my paint, for a ship ought to keep up her beauty and look as young as she can. But I have an ice mark around my breast, which is usually taken for a proof of experience, and as a philosopher I say that all waters are tolerable enough if one carries the talisman. But can a ship be beautiful? And what is the talisman? Asked the Italian and the Nubian together. One at a time, please. My dear, she addressed the Italian, the point is that men whom we serve think us beautiful indeed. It seems strange to us who carry the thought of the forests we have left, and on warm days, when the sap awakes in us and tries to climb again, forgetting its weakness, we miss the green boughs and the moss at our feet and the birds overhead. But I have studied my reflection often enough in calm weather, and begin to see what men have in mind when they admire us. And the talisman? Asked the Nubian again. The talisman? There is no one cure for useless regret, but each must choose his own. With me it is the thought of the child after whom I was christened. The day they launched me was her first birthday, and she a small thing held in the crook of her mother's arm. When the bottle swung against my stern, the wine spurted, and some drops of it fell on her face. The mother did not see me take the water. She was too busy wiping the drops away. But it was a successful launch, and I have brought the family luck, while she has brought them happiness. Because of it, and because our names are alike, her parents think of us together, and sometimes when one begins to talk of Thekla, the other will not know for a moment which of us is meant. They drink my health too, on her birthday, which is the 14th of May, and you know King Solomon's verse for the 14th. She is like the merchant's ships, she bringeth her food from afar. That is what I have done while she was growing, for King Solomon wrote it for a wife, of course. But now I shall yield up my trust, for when I return she is to be married. She shall bind that verse upon her with a coral necklace I carry for my gift, and it shall dance on her white throat when her husband leads her out to open the wedding ball. Since you are so fond of children, said the Touch-me-not, tell me, what shall we do for the one I have on my deck? He is the small boy who signals Christmas to us from the garden above, and he dreams of nothing but the sea, though his parents wish him to stick to his books and go to college. The Dane did not answer for a moment. She was considering. Wherever he goes, she said at length, and whatever he does, he will find that to serve much is to renounce much. Let us show him that what is renounced may yet come back in beautiful thoughts. And it seemed to the boy that as she ceased, a star dropped out of the sky and poised itself above the fir tree on her maintopmast, and that the bare mast beneath it put forth branches, while upon every branch, as it spread, a globe of fire dropped from the star, until a gigantic Christmas tree soared from the deck away up to heaven, In the blaze of it the boy saw the miracle run from ship to ship, the timber bursting into leaf with the song of birds and the scent of tropical plants. Across the avenue of teak which had been the Nubian's bulwarks, he saw the Dutchman's galley, now a summer-house set in parterres of tulips. Beyond it the sails of the Maria Stella Maris, shaken from the yards, were piling themselves into snowy mountains, their foot-ropes and braces trailing down and breaking into leaves and clusters of the vine. He heard the murmur of streams flowing, the hum of bees, the whetting of the scythes, even the stir of insects' wings among the grasses. From truck to keelson the ships were wavering, dissolving part from part into remote but unforgotten hiding-places, whence the mastering adventurer had torn them to bind and yoke them in service. Divine the service, but immortal also the longing to return. But there the glorious Lord will be unto us a place of broad rivers and streams, wherein shall go no galley with oars, neither shall gallant ship pass thereby. The boy heard the words, but before he understood them, a hand was on his shoulder, and another voice speaking above him. "God bless us, it's you, is it? Here's a nice tale to tell your father, I must say." He opened his eyes, and above Captain Tanguy's shoulder the branches faded, the lights died out, and the masts stood stripped and bare for service against the cold dawn. End of section 23.
Section 24 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kyle Donelan. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. The Keepers of the Lamp. It was in a purple twilight of May that I first saw the lamp shining. For me, a child of 7, the voyage had been a tiring one. It seemed many hours since, with a ringing of bells, and hearts adventurously throbbing with the screw of our small steamboat, we had backed and swung, casting our wash in waves along the quay walls. And so, after a pause during which we held our breath and drifted from the line of watching faces, had headed away for the great empty skyline beyond which the islands lay. I knew that they lay yonder, for the evening before my father had led me up a tall hill and pointed them out to me, black specks in the red ball of the sun. But today, as hour after hour went by with the pant of the engines, the lift and slide of the Atlantic swell, the tonic wind humming against the stays, my eyes grew heavy, and at length my head dropped against my father's shoulder. And then, to me it seemed the next instant, he woke me up and pointed towards the islands as they rose out of the indigo sea. At first they looked rather like low-lying clouds, but after a minute or two there was no mistaking them, for, as if they had just discovered us, they hung out lamp after lamp, some steady, some intermittent, but all of them gleaming yellow along the floor of the sea save one, a crimson light which hid and showed itself again northward of the rest. Crimson was my favorite color in those days, and even as I dropped back into sleep, I decided that I liked this lamp the best of all. I awoke again to the sound of voices. We were passing a pilot boat out there on the watch for ships. Her crew hailed us as we went by, and I saw their faces in the green radiance of our starboard light. Gaunt, dark faces, altogether foreign. One of the men, the oldest, was bareheaded, with long gray locks, and wore a yellow neckcloth with his shirt open below it, and his naked chest showing. Their voices as they answered our skipper were clear and gay like the voices of children. And, next, we were along a quay. Our seats, our bulwarks, even our decks shone with dew. A crowd stood on the dim quay edge and looked down on us, and chattered, but in soft voices. There was a policeman, too, and I wondered how he came there. Above this shadowy, moving crowd rode the stars I had known at home. I took my father's hand. At the head of the gangway he stooped, hoisted me on his shoulders, and carried me up and up through narrow, mysterious streets, around dark corners, past belated islanders hurrying down to the steamer, but always upward, until he pushed open a door and set me down blinking in a whitewashed bedroom lit by a couple of candles, and with that came sleep. Happy days followed, blue and white days vaulted and floored with blue, flashing with white granite, with the rush of white water beneath the shadow of the leaning sail, with white cirrus clouds, with white wings of seabirds. It was the height of the nesting season, and the birds had brought us to the islands, my father with paintbox and camera. Though, our time being short, he relied almost wholly on the latter. A naturalist, and by temper the gentlest of men, in his methods he was a born pioneer. You can hardly imagine how cumbrous and well-nigh hopeless a business it was in those days, not so long past, to pursue after wildlife with a camera. But 1,000 disheartening failures left him still grasping the inviolable shade, still confident that in photography, if it could only be given with rapidity and precision, lay the naturalist's hope. Blurred negatives were all the spoil, and sorry enough, we bore back after long days of tossing and climbing among the outer islands, but we had the reward of living among the birds. They filled our thoughts, our lives for the time. Great cormorants and northern divers, flitting red-legged oyster-catchers, shags spreading their wings to the wind and sun, sea parrots, murres, razor-bills, gannets questing by ones and twos, now poised, now dropping like plummets with a resounding splash. Sandpipers and curlews dotting the beaches and waiting. Tern, common gulls, herring gulls, and kittiwakes, and, at nightfall, shearwaters popping from their holes and swimming and skimming around our boat as we headed for home. And then the nests we discovered. Nay, the nests that at all times we walked among, picking our steps like egg dancers. Nests boldly planted on the bare rock ledges. Nests snugly hidden among the clusters of blue thrift and the massed sea pinks. They bloomed everywhere, these sea pinks, sheet upon sheet of pale rose color, soon to show paler and fade before the rosy splendors of the mesembryanthemum. But the thrift had no rival to fear, condensing blue heaven and blue sea in the flower it lifted against both, and to lie prone and make a frame of it, for some winding channel when the tide rip flashed, and toss was to send the eye plunging into blue like an eastern diver after pearls. But when after sunset the blue deepened to violet, always in the heart of it glowed the crimson light upon Off Island. Night after night I watched it from my window, and wondered what manner of people they were who tended it, living out yonder on a rock where no grass grew, and in a roar of tide which the inhabitants of the greater islands heard on still days in the few inland valleys, where it was possible to lose sight of the sea. I knew that thousands of puffins bred there, and we were to visit the rock some day. But, what with the tides and an all but ceaseless groundswell, our opportunity was long in coming, and old Seth, our boatman, kept putting it off until I began to disbelieve in it altogether. It came, though, at last, with a cloudless morning and a northeasterly breeze, brisk and steady, the clearest day in a fortnight of clear days. We were heading northward close-hauled through a sound dividing two of the greater islands. Old Seth at the tiller, my father tending the sheet, and I perched on the weather gunwale, and peering over and down on the purple reefs we seemed to avoid so narrowly, when Seth lifted his voice in a shout, and then, with a word of warning, paid out sheet, brought the boat's nose round and ran her in towards a silver-white beach on our left. As we downed sail, I saw a girl on the bank above the beach, leaning on a hoe and gazing at us over a low hedge of veronica. Seth hailed her again, and she came running to the waterside. There she stood and eyed us shyly. A dark-haired girl, bareheaded, and with the dust of the potato patch on her shoes and ankles. "Any message for Rube Hicks, my dear? We'm bound over to Off Island." She hesitated, looking from Seth to us, and while she hesitated, a flush mounted to her tanned face and deepened there. "Come," old Seth coaxed her. "You needn't be afeard to trust us with your little secrets." She seemed, at all events, to have made up her mind to trust us. From the pocket of her skirt she drew a tattered, paper-covered book, opened it, and was about to tear out a couple pages, but paused. "I'd like to send it," said she, but still paused and at length passed the open book to Seth. "I see," he nodded. "Seems a pity, don't it, to tear up good printed stuff? Tell you what," he suggested. "You leave me take the book over as 'tis, and this evening, if you'll be waiting here, I'll bring it back safe." She brightened at once. "That'll do brave. Tellin' I hope he's keepin' well, and give my love to the others." "Right you are," promised Seth cheerfully, pushing off. "And don't you forget," she called after us. Seth laughed. "That's a very good girl now," he commented as he settled himself to the tiller again. "Must be a poor job courtin' with a lighthouse man. Not much walking together for they. No harm, I suppose. And you're seeing the maid's book." He handed it to my father, who shook his head. "Aw," went on Seth, guessing why he hesitated. "There's no writing in it. Only print." He held the book open. It was a nautical almanac. And night by night the girl had penciled out the hour of sunset. Night by night the first flash of the off-island lamp carried her lover's message to her, and, as Seth explained, but it needed no explanation, at that signal she blotted out yet one more of the days between her and the marriage day. Off-island rose from the sea a sheer mass of granite, about 150 feet in height, and all but inaccessible had it not been for a rock stairway hewn out by the brethren of the Trinity House. The keepers had spied our boat, and a tall young man stood on one of the lower steps to welcome us. Not Reuben, but Reuben's younger brother Sam. Reuben met us at the top of the staircase, where the puffins built so thickly that a false step would almost certainly send the foot crashing through the roof of one of their oddly shaped houses. He, too, was a tall youth, an inch or two taller, maybe, than his brother, whom we had left in charge of the boat. It would have puzzled you to guess their ages. Young they surely were, but much gazing in their face of the salt wind had creased the corners of their eyes, and their faces wore a beautiful gravity, as though they had been captured young and dedicated to some priestly service. Reuben touched his cap, and taking the book from Seth without a word, led us to the cottage where his mother stood scoring a deal table. A little woman with dark eyes like beads, and thin gray hair tucked within a gray muslin cap. She had kilted her gown high and tucked up her sleeves and looked to me for all the world like a doll on a pen wiper. But her hands were busy continually. The small room shone and gleamed with her tireless cleansing and polishing. And in the midst of it, her eyes sparkled with the expectation of news from the outer world. Seth understood her, and rattled at once into a recital of all the happenings on the islands. Births, marriages, and deaths, sickness, courtship, and boat building, the price of market stuff, and the names of vessels newly arrived in the roads. But after a minute, she turned from him to my father. "'Tis all so narrow, sir, Seth's news. I want to know what's happening in the world." Now much was happening in those May weeks, much all over Europe, but much indeed in France, where Paris was passing through the sharp agonies of the Commune. The latest my father had to tell was almost a week old, but 2 days before we set sail for the islands, the Versailles troops had swept the boulevards, and every steamer had brought newspapers from the mainland. Mrs. Hicks's eyes grew bigger and rounder as she listened, but she had listened a very short while before she cried, "Father must hear this. He's up polishing the lantern, sir. Begging your pardon, but he must hear you tell it, he must indeed." With immense pride she added, "He was over to France one time." She marched us off to the lantern, up the winding stairway, up the ladder, and into the great glass cage, where stood an old man busily polishing the brass reflector. "Father, here's a gentleman come, with news from France." As the old man came forward with a fumbling step, my father drew a thick bundle from his coat pocket. "I brought you some newspapers," said he. "They will tell you more than I can." He held them out, but the wife interposed hurriedly. "Not to him, sir. Give them to Reuben, if you please, and thank you. But he, sir, he's blind." I looked as my father looked. A film covered both pupils of the old man's eyes. "He's been blind these 7 years," Reuben explained in a low voice. "Me and Sam are the regular keepers now, but the board lets him live on here, and he's terrible clever at polishing. He knows the lamp so well as ever he did, broke in the old woman. The leastest little scratch, he don't miss it. How he doesn't break his poor neck is more'n I can tell. But he don't, though 'tis a sore trial. While they explained, the old man's hand went out to caress the lamp, but stopped within an inch of the sparkling lenses. "Iss," said he musingly, "with this here cataract I misses a brave lot. There's a lot to be seen up here for a man with eyesight. Will you tell me, please, sir, what's the news from France? I was over there one time." It turned out he had once paid a visit to one of the small Breton ports, Roscoff I think it was, and have a suspicion that smuggling lay at the bottom of the business there. "Well now," he commented as my father told something of his tale, "I wouldn't have thought it of the Johnnies. They treated me very pleasant, and I speak of a man as I find him." He turned his sightless eyes on the family he had brought up to think well of Frenchmen. "They are different folk in Paris. That's a big place. Cherbourg's a big place too, they tell me. I came near going there one time, but my travelling's over. It do give a man something to think over, though. I wish my son here could have travelled a bit before settling down." But Reuben on the far side of the lantern was turning the pages of the tattered almanac. "Well, oh well," said the old woman, "a body must be thankful for good sons, and mine be that. But I love to end my days setting in a window and watching folks go by to church." It was past 7 o'clock when we hoisted sail again, and as we drew near the greater islands, a crimson flash shot out over the sea in our wake. On a dim beach ahead stood a girl waiting. End of section 24. Recording by Kyle Donelan.
Section 25 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. Two Boys. I dare say they never saw, and perhaps never will see one another. I met them on separate railway journeys, and the dates are divided by 5 years almost. One boy was travelling third class, the other first. The age of each, when I made his very slight acquaintance with the one I did not even exchange a word, was about 14. Almost certainly their lives and their stories have no connection outside of my thoughts, but I think of them often and together. They have grown up. The younger will be a man by this time. If I met them now, their altered faces would probably be quite strange to me. And yet, the two boys remain my friends, and that is why I take leave to include them among these stories of my friends. Part 1. The first boy, I never heard his name, was seated in the third-class smoking carriage when I joined my train at Plymouth. Seated beside his mother, an overheated countrywoman in a state of subsiding fussiness. We had a good 5 minutes to wait, but as such women always will, she had made a bolt for the first door within reach. Of course, she found herself in a smoking compartment, and of course she disliked tobacco, but could not, although she made 2 false starts, make up her mind to change. She had dropped upon one of the middle seats and dragged her boy down into the next, thus leaving me the only vacant corner. The others were occupied by a couple of drovers and a middle-aged man with a newspaper which he read column by column, advertisements and all, without raising his eyes for a moment. The guard just outside the carriage door had his whistle to his lips and his green flag lifted ready to wave, when the woman asked, "Can anyone tell me if this train goes to London?" The drovers and I assured her that it did. "It stops at Bristol, doesn't it? My ticket is for Bristol." The train was in motion by this time. We set her mind at ease. She opened a limp basket, called a frail, I believe, produced an apple and offered it to the boy. He shook his head. He was a passably good-looking, coltish boy in a best suit which he had outgrown, and a hard black hat, the brim of which annoyed him when he leaned back. A binding of black braid advertised what it was meant to conceal, that the cuffs of his jacket had been lengthened, and yet as he sat with his hands crossed in his lap, he displayed a good deal of wrist. His eyes took my liking at once, eyes of a good grey-black, or shall I say, of a grey with fine glooms in it. They looked at you straight, but without staring, neither furtively nor with embarrassment, nor curiously, nor again sleepily, but with that rare blend of candour and reserve which allowed you to see that he was thinking his own thoughts, and had no reason to be ashamed of them. Having taken stock of us, he gazed thoughtfully out of the window. His mother sighed from time to time, and searched her basket to make sure that this, that, or the other trifle had not been left behind. The drovers conversed apart. The middle-aged man, who sat facing the engine, read away pertinaciously at his newspaper, which he kept folded small by reason of the strong southerly breeze playing in through the open window, and I divided my attention between the landscape and the map at the beginning of Stevenson's Kidnapped, then barely a week old, a delight to be approached with trepidation. So we were sitting when the train crawled over the metals beyond Tynemouth station, gathered speed, and swung into full view of the open sea. As the first strong breath of it came rushing in at the window, I heard a shuffle of feet. The boy had risen, and with his eyes was asking our leave to stand by the door. I drew in my knees to make way for him, and so after a moment did the middle-aged man. He did not thank us, but stepped past politely enough, and stood with his hand on the leathern window strap. I stared out of the little side window, wondering what had caught his attention. And while I wondered, suddenly the child broke into song. It was the queerest, artless performance. It had no tune in it, no intelligible words. It was just a chant, rising and falling as the surf at the base of the sea wall boomed and tossed its spray on the wind, fanning his face. And while he chanted, his serious eyes devoured the blue leagues right away to the horizon. The drovers at the far end of the compartment turned their faces inward and grinned. The middle-aged man looked across at me behind the boy's back with a half-smile, and resumed his reading. The mother laughed apologetically. "'Tis his way. He won't be so crazed for it in a few weeks' time, I reckon. He's going up to Bristol to be bound apprentice to his uncle. His uncle's master of a sailing ship." But the boy did not hear. There are 4 or 5 tunnels in the red sandstone between Tonmouth and Dawlish, and through these he sang on in a low, repressed voice, which broke out high and clear and strong as we swept again into the large wind and sunshine. At Dawlish station we drew up for a minute, and the porter on the up platform nodded to one of the drovers and asked, "What's the matter with 'ee in there?" Nothing, we got a smoking concert on," said the drover. Across the rails a group waiting for the down train stood and stared at the boy, whispered and smiled. And I can still recall the fascinated gaze of a plump urchin of 6 as he gripped with one hand a wooden spade and with the other his mother's skirt. But the boy sang on heedless, and still sang on as we left Dawlish behind. There was no jubilation in his chant, but through it all there ran and rang out from time to time a note of high challenge. Perhaps I read too much in it, for in the heart of a boy many thoughts sing together before they come to birth, and to the destinies we see so distinctly he marches through a haze, drawn onward by incommunicable yearnings. But as, unseen by him, I glanced up at his blown hair and eager parted lips, the chant seemed to grow articulate. "O sea, I am coming. O fate, waiting and waited for, I salute you. Friend or adversary, we meet to try each other. For your wonders I have eyes, for your trials a heart. Use me, for I am ready." As we turned inland and ran beside the shore of the Exe, his song died down and ceased. For a while he stood conning the river, the boats, the red cliffs and whitewashed towns on the farther bank, and so as we came in sight of the cathedral towers, stepped back and dropped into his seat. "Well now," said his mother, "you be a funny boy." For a moment he did not seem to hear, then started and came out of his daydream with a furious blush. I looked away. Part 2. The second boy wore a well-cut Eton suit and sat in the smoking compartment of a padded corridor carriage, with a silk-lined overcoat beside him and a silver-mounted suitcase in the rack above. He was not smoking, nor was he reading, but he sat on a great pile of papers and magazines and stared straight in front of him, that is to say, straight at me. His stare, though constant and unrelenting, was not in the least offensive. It had no curiosity in it. He had obviously been contemplating the cushions before I intruded, and since I had chosen to occupy his field of vision, he contemplated me. I had no speaking acquaintance with the boy, but he bore the features of his family, and his initials were on the suitcase above, so I knew him for the only son of a man who had once shown me civility. The youngest and least extravagantly wealthy of 3 rich brothers. Since one of these brothers had never married, and now was not likely to, it lay beyond guessing what wealth the boy would inherit some day. He was by no means ill-looking, and quite certainly no fool. His face carried the stamp of his father's ability. It puzzled me what he could be doing with that pile of papers and magazines, or why, having burdened himself with them, he should choose to sit and stare instead of reading them, for his station lay but a 20-minutes run below mine, and it was impossible that in the time he could have glanced through the half of them. He had been staring at me, or through me, maybe for half an hour, when our train slowed down and came to a standstill above the steep valley between Bodmin Road and Doubleboy. After a couple of minutes' wait, the boy rose and went to the window in the corridor to see what was happening, and I took this opportunity to glance across at the papers scattered on the vacant seat. They included 3 or 4 sixpenny and threepenny magazines, a large illustrated paper, black and white, I think, half a dozen penny weeklies, Titbits, Answers, Pearson's Weekly, Castle's Saturday Journal, I forget what others, halfpenny papers in a heap, all kinds of cuts, snippets, siftings, echoes, snapshots, and sidelights, pars about people, Christian sweepings, Our Happy Fireside, and The Masher. Many lay face downward, coyly hiding their titles, but disclosing such headlines as Facts About the Flag, Books Which Have Influenced the Bishop of London, He Gave Him Fits, Our Unique Competition, Mr. Cecil Rhodes, a Powerful Personality, and What Becomes of Old Stage Scenery. In the midst of my survey, the train began to move forward again, and the boy came back to his seat. "It's only some plate layers on the viaduct," he explained. "They held up their flag against us. I suppose they were just finishing a job." "Nasty place to leave the rails," said I, glancing over the parapet upon the green tree-tops 50 feet below us. "I was thinking that," said he, and a queer tremor in his young voice made me glance at him sharply. And then suddenly I understood, or thought I did. "You, at any rate, are pretty well insured," said I. £20,000 and a little over. The coupons cost 4 and 2 pence altogether, and then at the end of the journey you can use up all the reading." "Wonderful!" I kept a serious face. "And I suppose all this time you've been staring at me, amazed by the recklessness of your elders." He flushed slightly. "Have I been staring? I beg your pardon. I'm sure it's a trick I have. I begin thinking of things and then... Thinking, I suppose, of how it would feel to be in a collision, or what it would be like to leap such a parapet as that and find ourselves dropping into space. But you shouldn't, really. It isn't healthy in a boy like you, and if you'll listen to one who has known what nerves are, it may too easily grow to mean something worse. But it isn't that exactly, he protested. Though, of course, all that comes into it, I'm not a funk, sir. I was thinking more of what would come afterwards, you know. Oh, dear, I groaned to myself. It's worse than ever. Here's a little prig worrying about his soul. I shouldn't advise you to trouble about that either, I said aloud. But I don't trouble about it. He hesitated and stumbled into a burst of confidence. You see, I'm no good at games, athletics, and that sort of thing. Again he stopped, and I nodded to encourage him. And I'm no swell at schoolwork either. I went to school late, and after home it all seemed so young, if you understand. I thought I did. With his polite, grown-up manner, I could understand his isolation among the urchins, the masters, and all the interests of an ordinary school. But my father, you know him, don't you? He's disappointed about it. He'd like me to bring home prizes or cups. I don't think he'd mind what it was, so long as he could be proud about it. Of course, he never says anything, but a fellow gets to know. I dare say you're right, I said. But what has this to do with insuring yourself for £20,000? Well, you see, I'm to go into the bank some day, and I expect my father thinks I shall be just as big a duffer at that. I know he does, but I'm not, if he'd only trust me a bit. So now, if we were to smash up, collide, go off the rails, run over a bridge, or something of that sort, just think how he'd feel when he found out I'd cleared 20,000 by it. So that's what you were picturing to yourself. He nodded. That, and the smash and all. I kept saying, now, if it comes this moment. And I wondered a little how it would take you suddenly, whether you'd start up or fall forward, and if you would say anything. You're a cheerful companion. He grinned politely. And afterwards, just before the train stopped, I had a splendid idea. I began making my will. You see, I know something about investments. I read about them every day. In the boys' own paper. We take in the Standard in our school library, and I have it all to myself unless there's a war on. I've heard my father say often that it's a very reliable paper, and so it is, for I've tried it for 2 years now. So if I left a will telling just how the 20,000 ought to be invested, it would open my father's eyes more than ever. My dear sir, said I, don't be in a hurry. Serve out your time among the barbarians at school, and I'll promise you in time your father's respectful astonishment. These were my 2 boys, and you may wonder why I always think of them together. I do, though, and what is more, I find that together they help to explain to me my country's greatness. End of section 25.
Section 26 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendrie. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Quiller-Couch. Section 26. The Senior Fellow. There is at Oxford a small college, with a small bursar's garden, that in spring is ablaze with laburnum and scented with lilac. And in the old wall of this garden, just beneath the largest laburnum tree, you may still find a stone with this inscription: Jesus have mercy on Miles Tonkin, Fellow, Anno 1545. This college, in the days when I knew it, had 3 marks of distinction. It turned out, on hunting mornings, more pinks for its size than any other in Oxford. Its boat was head of the river, and its senior fellow was the Reverend Theobald Pumphrey, who knew more of Athenaeus than any man in the world. He seldom lectured, but day by day, year after year, sat in the window above this same small garden, and accumulated notes for the great edition of his pet author that some day, nobody quite knew when, was to make him famous. He was the son of a Cumberland farmer, had come up to the university from a local grammar school, and since then, it was said, had revisited his native village twice only, to bury his father and mother. His mother's death, and that had happened 25 years before, left him without a single relative on earth, nor could he be said to have a friend, even among the Dons. He rose early, took a solitary walk in the parks, and would spend the rest of the day at his desk by the window. People marvelled sometimes why he had taken holy orders. It was hinted that his scout knew, perhaps, but if so, his scout never divulged the reasons. The scholar was a man, nevertheless, had a humorously wrinkled mouth and an eye that twinkled responsive to a jest, and was the best judge of wine in Oxford. On the strength of this undeniable gift, the Dons had long since elected him Steward of Common Room, and he valued the responsibility, abstaining from tobacco, which he loved, to keep pure his taste for vintages, and preserve a discriminating palate among sweets. An utterance of his would hint that even his avoidance of physical exercise was a matter of duty. A man, he said, may work his body, may work his head, and may enjoy his dinner. Any 2 of these things he may do, but not all 3. For me, I wish to work my head, and must enjoy my dinner. And once, when I dined with him, it was made clear to me that his life was ordered after a plan. It was a summer evening, and he held a glass of claret against the sunset. "Wife and children," he cried suddenly, "wife and children." Then, with a wave of his left hand from the claret to the still lawn below us and the lilacs, "These are my wife and children." It was whispered at length that his commentary on the first book of the Dipnosophists was all but ready. All through the golden summer and a quiet long vacation it had been maturing, and on the first night of the October term he arranged his piles of notes about him, set a quire of clean manuscript paper on his table, dipped pen in inkpot, and began to muse on the first sentence. An hour passed, and the page was not soiled. Across the still garden came the sound of cab wheels rattling over the distant streets. The undergraduates were coming up for a fresh term. He had heard the sound 100 times almost, and it did not concern him. He had no lectures to prepare. Another hour passed, and another. The noise of the cabs had died out, and over him was creeping a sick fear, a certainty that he could not write a word. The subject was too immense. He had given his life to Athenaeus, and now Athenaeus was a monster that one man's life and knowledge would not suffice for. Having withheld his pen till he might write adequately, he awoke to find that writing was impossible. A horror took him as he pushed back his chair among the litter of notebooks, and stepping to the window, threw the sash open. Many stars were shining, and between them and the sleeping garden echoed the clamour of a distant supper party. He heard no words, only the noise, but it filled his brain with a sense of the many thousand supper parties that the garden had listened to, of the generations that had come and gone since his own first term, of the boys who had grown into men while he was working at Athenaeus, always Athenaeus. His forehead was burning, and as he pushed his hand across it, he seemed to read in the darkness under the laburnum tree, "Jesus have mercy on Miles Tonkin, fellow, anno 1545, and found a new meaning, an irony in the words. Then, because more and more the task of his life became a hopeless weight, he gave a look at his notebooks and escaped out of the room, downstairs into the fresh air of the quad, and across it towards the porter's lodge. He found the porter napping, and, having a private key, he let himself through the big gate and out into the street. No soul was abroad, only the gas lamps threw queer shadows of him on the pavement, and the night breeze struck coldly into him as he hurried along, hating whatever he saw. Soon, under a window in St. Giles, he pulled up. There was a party of young men inside, perhaps the same supper party whose voices he had heard just now. The light from the room flared across the street, but by keeping close under the sill he stood in darkness, and he paused, listening eagerly. Above they were singing a chorus, noted in those days. It was pale dawn, and the sun was touching St. Mary's spire into flame when the heavy-eyed porter heard a key turn in the wicket. It was the senior fellow, and in about half an hour he appeared again at the lodge, carrying a small bag, and handed the porter a letter addressed to the president of the college. He then stepped out into the street, and hurried off towards the railway station. For a fortnight we heard nothing of him. Then suddenly he appeared again, on an evening when the college, having won the fours, was commemorating its success by a bonfire in the big quad. A certain freshman, stealing down his staircase with a can of colza oil to feed the flames, was confronted by our missing senior fellow. "No," said the great scholar, "don't be afraid, and don't seek to hide that oil can, but come in here," and he led the way to his room. This much is mere rumour, for the freshman was always reticent on the encounter and what followed, but many who were present that night can bear witness that a big portmanteau appeared suddenly on the summit of the bonfire, and blazed merrily to ashes, having clearly been saturated with oil. Not until long after were its contents divined. The senior fellow went back to his window above the bursar's garden, though henceforward he dined but rarely in common room, and year by year scholars expected his edition of Athenaeus, until he died and left his desk full of notebooks to the youth who had carried the oil can, and who in course of years had become junior don. Also his will expressed a wish that this, his favourite pupil, might be elected to succeed him as steward of common room. The new steward, eager to fulfil his duties, made it his first business to inspect the college cellars. He found there abundance of old port, much fair claret, a bin of inestimable Madeira, several casks of more curious wines, and, among them, one labelled "For the Poor." It struck him as a pleasant trait in his dead friend, thus to have dispensed in charity that wine which doubtless had gone beyond its age, and become unfit for the fellows' palates. He drew a glassful and tasted it. The first sip was a revelation. He returned to his rooms, wrote a score of letters inviting to dinner all the acknowledged connoisseurs of other colleges. When they had dined with him and fallen into easy attitudes around the table, he introduced this wine casually among half a dozen others, and watched the result. Not a man who tasted it would taste any other. As for the notebooks, those priceless materials for the final edition of Athenaeus, they were empty, mere blank pages. Only in that labelled No. 1 was there a scrap of the old scholar's handwriting, and it began, "Dulce cum sodalibus, sapit vinum bonum, osculari virginis, dulcius est donum, donum est dulcissimum, musica tironum, qui tararabundiat, pernit regis thronum." End of section 26.
Section 27 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. Ballast. Under the green shore that faces the port, and at a point that as the meeting place of river and harbour may be called indifferently by either name, lay a slim waisted bark at anchor, with a sand barge alongside. The time was a soft and sunny morning in early January, a day that was nature's breathing space after a week of sleet and boisterous winds. The gulls were back again from their inland shelters. Across the upland, above the cliff, a ploughman drove leisurely forth and back, and always close behind his heels, the earth was white with these birds inspecting the fresh-turned furrow. The furze bushes below him were braided with cobwebs, and the stays, lifts, and braces of the bark might have passed also for threads of gossamer, spun from her masts and yards, so delicately were the lines indicated along the hillside. In the sandbarge 3 men were chanting as they worked, and their song, travelling across still sky and water, rose audibly above the stir of traffic even in the narrow streets of the town. The bark was taking in ballast, and the 3 men sang as they shovelled, for 3 reasons. It helped them to keep time, it kept each from shirking his share of the work, and lastly, perhaps, the song cheered them. They knew it as the Long 100, and it ran: "There goes one, one there is gone, oh, the rare one, and many more to come, for to make up the sum of the 100 so long. There goes 2," and so on, up to 20. With each line a shovelful of ballast was pitched on board by every man, so that, when the 26-line stanzas were ended, each man had thrown 120, a long 100 shovelfuls of sand. Thereupon they paused, touched pipe for a minute or two, and brushing the back of the hand across their foreheads to wring off the sweat, started afresh. Along the bark's side ran a narrow line of blue paint, signifying that the vessel was in mourning, that somebody belonging to captain or owner was lately dead. But in this case it was the captain and owner himself, and his chief mourner was a bright-eyed woman with a complexion of cream and roses, who now leant over the bulwarks and looked down contemplatively upon the 3 labourers. She was a Canadian, and her husband, too, had been a Canadian, rich, more than twice her age, and luxurious. Since his marriage she had accompanied him on all his voyages. 3 months ago his vessel had brought him, sick and suffering from congestion of the lungs, into this harbour, where his cargo of timber was to be unloaded, and in this harbour a week later he had died, without a doubt of his wife's affection. From the deck where she stood she can see between the elms on the hill above the port the white wall of the cemetery where he lay. The vessel was hers, and a snug little fortune in Quebec, and she was going back to enjoy it. For the homeward voyage she had deputed the captain's responsibilities to the first mate, and had raised his pay slightly, but the captain's dignity she reserved for herself. She wore a black gown, of course, but not a widow's cap, and though in fact a widow of 25, had very much more the appearance of a maid of 19 as she looked down over the bark's side. Her lips were parted as if to smile at the first provocation. On either side of her temples a short brown curl had rebelled and was kissing her cheek. The sparkle in her eyes told of capacity to enjoy life. Behind her a coil of smoke rose from the deck-house chimney. She had left the midday meal she was cooking, and ought to be back looking after it. Instead, she lingered and looked upon the 3 men at work below. 2 of them were old, round-shouldered with labour, their necks burnt brown with stooping in the sun. The 3rd was a young giant, tall, fair, and straight, with yellowish hair that curled up tightly at the back of his head, and lumbar muscles that swelled and sank in a pretty rhythm as he pitched his ballast and sang, "There goes 9, 9 there is gone." It was upon this man that the woman gazed as she lingered. His shirt-collar was cut low at the back, and his freckled neck was shining with sweat. She wanted him to look up, and yet she was afraid of his looking up. She wondered if he were married. At his age, she phrased it to herself, and if so, what manner of wife he had. She told herself after a while that she really dreaded extremely being caught observing these 3 labourers, that she hated even in seeming to lose dignity. And still she bent and heard the song to the 20th and last verse. The young giant, when the spell was over, leant on his shovel for a moment, and then reached out a hand for the cider keg. One of his comrades passed it to him. He wiped the orifice, tilted his head back, and drank as a man drinks at midday after a long morning. Some of the cider trickled down his crisp yellow beard, and he shook his head, scattering the drops off. Then the keg was tilted again, and suddenly lowered, as he was on the point of drinking. His eyes had encountered those of the woman on the deck. As they did so, the woman recovered all her boldness. Without in the least knowing what prompted her, she bent a little further forward and asked, "What is your name, young man?" "William Muddy, ma'am." "Do you mind breaking off work for a moment and stepping up here?" "Certainly, ma'am." William Muddy laid down his shovel at once. A shiver of fear went through the young widow. Why had she asked him up? Why on a mere impulse? Because she wanted to see him closer, nothing more. What possible excuse could she give? She heard the sound of his heavy boots on the ship's ladder. He would be before her in a moment, expecting, of course, to be set to work on some odd job or other. She cast about wildly, and could think of no job that wanted doing. It was appalling. She could not possibly explain. As has happened before now to women, her very weakness saved her in extremity. William Udy, clambering heavily over the ship's side, found her leaning against the deck-house, with a face as white as the painted boards against which her palm rested. "What be I to do, ma'am?" he inquired after a pause, and then added slowly, "Begging your pardon, but be you taken unwell?" "Yes," she panted, speaking very faintly. "I was over there by the bulwarks, and suddenly I felt queer, a faintness. I looked over and saw you. I called the first person I saw. I wanted help." William Udy was puzzled. He had not noticed any pallor in the face that had looked down on him from the ship's side. On the contrary, he seemed to remember that it struck him as remarkably fresh and rosy. But he saw no reason for doubting he had been mistaken. "Can I do aught for 'ee? Fetch a doctor?" "If you wouldn't mind helping me down to my cabin." William took her arm gently and led her aft to the companion ladder. At the top of it she put out a hand vaguely and closed her eyes. "I don't think," she murmured, "that I can walk. My head is going round so. Would it be too heavy if you carried me?" At any other time William would have considered this a good joke. As it was, he took her up like a feather in his arms and carried her down to the cabin. There he set her down on the sofa and was about to withdraw, blushing. He was a very shy youth and had never carried a woman before, let alone one who was his superior in station. "Thank you," she said in a voice that was little above a whisper. "How easily you carried me. It's plain to see you're a married man." William started. "There you're wrong, ma'am. Pardon me for saying it." "No? You were so gentle, although so big." She smiled faintly. "Would you mind stepping to the cupboard there and pouring me out a wine glassful of sherry? It's in the decanter just inside." William poured out a glassful and set it on the table in front of her. She put it to her lips, and having scarcely moistened them, set it down again. "A glass for yourself," she said. "Come now, do. I see you are shocked at the number of bottles I keep here, but they were my husband's. He died, you know, a week after we came into harbour." William's face worked to express mute sympathy. "It's a fearful responsibility," she went on, "being left alone like this with a vessel to look after, and all his property waiting over there on the other side of the water, and I dare say the lawyers there waiting too, to take advantage of me. I think it's having all this on my mind that makes my head so giddy at times." William stood opposite to her and thought. It is not known at what moment the brilliant idea struck him that as a husband he might be a tower of strength to the fragile young creature on the sofa. His comrades, after waiting some time for him, began their chant again. "There goes one, one there is gone." And while they sang it, William began that courtship which ended 3 weeks later in his sailing for Canada. He went as a bridegroom, or perhaps, if we must reckon him as part of the ship's equipment, as ballast. End of section 27, and end of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch.